Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The wind howled through the towering pines as my flashlight beam cut a path through the thick, suffocating darkness. Something was wrong. I'd spent a decade patrolling these woods, but tonight everything felt off. Unnervingly quiet, like the entire forest was holding its breath. And then I saw them, massive canine tracks circling the campsite like a predator closing in. I've been a ranger in this park for nearly 10 years, and let me tell you, I've seen it all. Bears raiding campsites, hikers getting lost, even the occasional cougar stalking the edges of the trails. But that night, it was different. The air was thick with a kind of tension I couldn't quite place, like the forest was watching me. And whatever was out there, it wasn't something I recognized. It started like any other night shift. I was stationed near Pine Hollow, a popular camping spot for tourists looking to get away from it all. It was early fall, and the nights were getting colder, the kind where the chill creeps into your bones if you stand still too long. My rounds usually took me through the main trails, checking in on the campers, making sure everyone was accounted for. Simple enough. I was about halfway through my patrol when I got a call on the radio. "Hey, Jake, you near Site 7? We got some folks hearing weird noises. Might just be a raccoon or something, but you know how people get." "Copy that. I'm close. I'll swing by and check it out," I responded, already turning in that direction. Nothing unusual for this time of year. Animals get more active, foraging before winter hits, and campers, especially city folks, tend to get jittery when they hear something rustling in the bushes. The closer I got to Site 7, though, the more that feeling of unease settled in. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, had faded into an eerie silence. Even the wind seemed to die down, as if nature itself was holding back, waiting for something. I reached the edge of the campsite, my flashlight bouncing off the tree trunks, and spotted the campers. A couple, mid-30s, huddled close to their fire, their faces pale in the flickering light. As soon as they saw me, they rushed over. "Thank God you're here," the man said, his voice tight with anxiety. "We heard something big. It was circling the camp for the last half hour. It didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard." I glanced around. The fire crackled, casting long shadows over the tents and trees. "Could have been a bear," I said, though I knew bears didn't typically make themselves known like that. "Any tracks?" The woman shook her head, her eyes wide. "It wasn't a bear. We saw something big, but it was moving too fast. We only caught glimpses through the trees." I could see the fear in their eyes, but I still wasn't convinced. Probably just a spooked deer or an overactive imagination fueled by a long night in the woods. Still, I figured it wouldn't hurt to take a quick look around. I told the couple to stay near the fire while I made a sweep of the perimeter. The air was colder now, biting at the back of my neck as I moved away from the light of the camp. My boots crunched softly against the pine needles, and I kept my flashlight low, scanning the ground. That's when I saw them. Tracks, huge, canine-like, and much too big to be any wolf or dog I'd ever seen. My heart skipped a beat, and I crouched down for a closer look. The prints were fresh, still crisp in the damp earth, and they circled the entire campsite. Whatever it was had been close, real close. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I'd seen wolf tracks before. I'd seen bear tracks, mountain lions, you name it. But these were different. They were too large, too deep, and the spacing between them suggested something massive, something that moved with an unnatural gait. I stood up, scanning the tree line, my hand resting on the radio clipped to my vest. The wind picked up again, whispering through the branches, and for a moment I thought I heard something. A low, guttural growl carried on the wind, distant but unmistakable. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the sudden surge of adrenaline. I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. I'd call in the tracks, have someone come out in the morning to take a look. But for now, I needed to get these campers reassured and back to safety. Turning back to the campsite, I started walking when something made me freeze. Just beyond the reach of my flashlight, a shadow shifted between the trees. Tall, broad, and moving fast. Too fast for any human. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of instinct than anything, raising my light toward the movement. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. But whatever had been there was gone. A knot tightened in my stomach. This was wrong. All of it. I quickened my pace back to the campsite and found the couple standing near the fire, looking even more terrified than before. "Pack your things," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We're heading back to the ranger station." The man frowned, looking confused. "What? Now?" "Yes, now," I replied, trying not to sound as rattled as I felt. "There's something out here, and I'd rather not stick around to find out what it is." They didn't argue. In a matter of minutes, they had their gear packed, and we were heading back down the trail toward the station. I kept them close, walking slightly ahead, my flashlight sweeping from side to side. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. The forest around us felt like it was closing in, watching us with unseen eyes. Halfway back to the station, the sound of footsteps echoed behind us. Not human footsteps, heavier, faster. Whatever it was moving through the trees, pacing us. I stopped, heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" The couple nodded, their faces pale in the dim light of the flashlight. The man opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, a low growl reverberated through the trees, closer this time. Too close. I turned, flashlight aimed into the forest, my hand instinctively reaching for the small revolver at my side. I'd never had to use it in all my years out here, but something about tonight felt different, desperate. For a moment there was nothing, just the silence, broken only by the wind and the distant rustling of leaves. But then, just at the edge of the light, I saw it. Two glowing eyes, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. They were high off the ground, too high for any animal I'd expect to see in these parts, and they were watching us, unblinking. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly backed up, keeping the light trained on those eyes. "Move," I whispered to the couple, trying not to alarm them further. "Slowly." They didn't need to be told twice. We began moving again, cautiously, every step measured, but the eyes stayed with us, following just beyond the reach of the light, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. I radioed into the station, my voice low but tense. "This is Jake. I've got 2 campers with me, and we're being followed by something large. We're about 20 minutes out, but I need backup out here, now." The response crackled through the radio. "Copy that. Sending a team your way." 20 minutes. That felt like a lifetime out here. As we walked, the growling became more frequent, more aggressive. Whatever it wasn't just watching us anymore. It was toying with us, testing our boundaries. I gripped the revolver tighter, praying I wouldn't have to use it. We were almost to the ranger station when the creature made its move. There was a crash in the trees to our left, and before I could react, a massive shape burst out of the underbrush, charging straight at us. I barely had time to raise my gun before it was on us. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stopped. The creature, whatever it was, stood there for a moment, its eyes locked on mine, its breath heavy and ragged in the cold air. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with matted fur and a body that was almost human, but not quite. Its head was canine, with long, sharp teeth that gleamed in the light of my flashlight. I didn't blink. I didn't move. And then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared back into the trees. The rest of the walk back was a blur. We made it to the station, and the campers were safe. But that thing, whatever it was, remains out there. And every time I patrol these woods at night, I feel its eyes watching me, Waiting. Story 2. I never thought I'd be the one to tell a story like this. As a forest ranger, I've seen my share of strange things in the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. The night when the line between reality and nightmare blurred, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've been a ranger at Blackwood National Forest for the past 7 years. I've always loved the outdoors, the smell of pine needles, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the sense of peace that comes with being surrounded by nature. But on that fateful night in late October, the forest I thought I knew so well became a place of terror. It started like any other night shift. I was doing my routine patrol, checking on campsites and making sure no fires had been left unattended. The air was crisp, carrying the first hint of the coming winter. A nearly full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. As I made my way along the main trail, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a sound I'd never heard before in all my years in the forest, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. At first I thought it might be a bear, but there was something off about it. The sound was too deep, too human. I switched off my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if every creature was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight, much higher off the ground than any animal I knew should be. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly reached for the radio at my belt. But before I could call for backup, the eyes blinked and vanished. I stood there frozen, straining my ears for any sound of movement. Suddenly, a twig snapped to my left. I whirled around, fumbling to turn my flashlight back on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. But as I swept the light back and forth, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth of the trail, was a footprint. But it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, and the shape was all wrong. It looked almost like a human footprint, but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. I knelt down to examine it more closely, my hand shaking as I reached out to touch the impression in the dirt. It was fresh, the edges still sharp and clear. Whatever had made this print had been here just moments ago. A rustle in the bushes behind me made me jump to my feet. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the foliage. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Ranger Mitchell. Is anyone there?" No response came, but I could have sworn I saw something move just beyond the reach of my light. Something big. I took a step backward, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement, a glimpse of something tall and covered in dark fur, disappearing behind a large oak tree. My training kicked in, and I found myself running back down the trail toward my truck. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind me, branches snapping and leaves rustling. Whatever it was fast, and it was following me. I burst out of the tree line, into the small clearing where I'd parked my truck. Fumbling with my keys, I managed to unlock the door and throw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I started the engine and peeled out of there, gravel spraying as I accelerated onto the main road. As I drove, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing after me. But the road behind me remained empty, the darkness of the forest seeming to press in on all sides. I radioed into the station, trying to keep my voice calm as I reported what I'd seen. But even as I spoke, I could hear how crazy it all sounded. A giant footprint, a tall, fur-covered creature. I knew what it sounded like, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. The next few days were a blur of questioning and doubt. My colleagues were supportive, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. We went back to the site where I'd seen the footprint, but rain had washed away any evidence that might have been there. Without proof, my story became just that, a story. But I knew what I'd seen, and in the weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at shadows, always feeling like I was being watched whenever I ventured into the deeper parts of the forest. The Blackwood that had once been my sanctuary now felt alien and threatening. It was about a month after the incident when things took another turn. I was back on night patrol, my first one since that night. I'd volunteered for it, partly to prove to myself that I could do it, and partly because I needed answers. The night was clear and cold, my breath forming small clouds in front of me as I walked. I found myself retracing my steps from that night, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the trail. As I neared the spot where I'd seen the footprint, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something felt off, like the air itself was charged with an unseen energy. I slowed my pace, every sense on high alert. That's when I heard it, the same deep, guttural growl from before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding me. I spun in a circle, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. "I know you're out there," I called out, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I'm not afraid of you." A lie, of course. I was terrified, but something in me had snapped. I was tired of being afraid, tired of doubting myself. If there was something out there, I was going to face it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, I began to make out a shape in the darkness ahead of me. It was as if the shadows themselves were coalescing, forming into something solid. My flashlight beam fell upon it, and I gasped. There, not 20 feet away from me, stood a creature that shouldn't exist. It was tall, at least 8 feet, covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were long, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me, a mix of human and animal features, with eyes that reflected an intelligence that seemed impossible. We stood there, the creature and I, locked in a moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity. I waited for it to charge, to attack, but it didn't move. It just watched me. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the camera I'd started carrying with me. The creature's eyes followed my movement, but it made no move to stop me. With shaking hands, I raised the camera and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the night for a split second, and in that moment the creature let out a roar that shook me to my core. Before I could react, it turned and bolted into the forest, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something of its size. I stood there, my heart pounding, the camera clutched tightly in my hands. I'd done it. I'd seen it again, and this time I had proof. The photo, when I finally worked up the courage to look at it, wasn't perfect. It was blurry, the creature partially obscured by the trees, but it was unmistakable. A large, fur-covered figure with glowing eyes, caught in the act of turning away. I'd like to say that the photo changed everything, that it proved once and for all that there are things in this world that defy explanation. But the truth is, it didn't. The experts called it a hoax, a clever costume or a trick of the light. My story became a local legend, whispered around campfires but never truly believed. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there in the depths of Blackwood Forest. And every time I put on my ranger uniform and step into those woods, I'm reminded that the line between the world we know and the world we don't is thinner than we'd like to believe. So if you ever find yourself in Blackwood National Forest and you hear a strange sound in the night or feel like you're being watched, just remember, you're not alone in the woods, and not everything that walks on 2 legs is human. Story 3. The fog swallowed everything. One moment I was hiking along a well-marked trail in the mountains, surrounded by the comforting sounds of the forest, birds, wind in the trees, the crunch of my boots on gravel. Then, in what felt like seconds, the world around me disappeared, buried in a blanket of thick, suffocating mist. And that's when I first heard it. Something moving, just beyond my sight, but close enough to send a chill racing down my spine. I'd always loved hiking alone. There was something about the solitude, the quiet, that allowed me to think more clearly. No distractions, no one around to slow me down or tell me where to go. Just me and the trail. That morning had started out like every other. The weather was perfect for a long hike, crisp but not too cold, with the sun filtering down through the trees in golden beams. The trail I chose was one I'd done before, a bit remote, but that was the appeal, a chance to get away from the world. About 2 hours in, I noticed the fog starting to roll in. At first, it was just a light mist creeping through the trees, but it quickly thickened, almost unnaturally fast. I've seen mountain fog before, but this was different. It was like a living thing, enveloping me in a heavy, damp cloak. The trail disappeared under my feet, and the trees faded into pale silhouettes in every direction. I wasn't worried at first. I knew the trail well, and I figured the fog would lift soon enough. But then I heard the first sound, a branch snapping, faint but deliberate off to my left. My steps faltered and I turned toward the noise, squinting into the fog. Nothing, just the same ghostly outlines of trees, their trunks stretching into the haze. It could have been anything. A deer, maybe, or some other animal moving through the woods. But the sound, it was too heavy, too distinct. I shook it off and kept moving, but my pace slowed. There's something about being alone in the fog that messes with your head. Every sound feels amplified, every step like it's being watched. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was beating a little faster now, my breath coming in shorter bursts. About 10 minutes later, the sound came again. Closer this time, a slow, deliberate crunch of something moving just out of sight. I stopped, straining to listen, the air thick and still around me. My ears picked up on the faintest rustle of leaves, like something brushing past the underbrush, but still nothing I could see. "Hello?" I called out, more to break the silence than anything, though I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe another hiker? It didn't make sense. No one else was supposed to be this far out today. No answer. Just the fog, so thick now it felt like it was closing in on me. A sense of unease crept in. I'm not one to spook easily, but there was something about this fog and those sounds that set me on edge. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it, but I knew it. My gut was screaming at me to turn back, but stubbornness, or maybe stupidity, kept me moving forward. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something shifted between the trees, a shadow, tall and wide, moving with a kind of purpose. My heart skipped. I whipped my head toward the movement, but there was nothing there, just fog and trees. But I knew what I saw. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my mind racing. Maybe it was just my imagination, playing tricks on me. The fog had a way of making everything feel distorted, unreal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was out there, and it was following me. I started walking again, faster now, my eyes darting from side to side, scanning the fog for any movement. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing but the crunch of my boots on the trail, and the distant, almost imperceptible sound of something else, something big, moving through the trees. I tried to convince myself it was a bear, maybe, or an elk, but that didn't sit right. I've encountered bears before, and this felt different. Bears don't stalk you. They don't follow you like that, step for step, staying just out of sight. The sound of my own breath was loud in my ears now, and the damp chill of the fog was sinking into my skin. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The fog was so thick I could barely see 5 feet in front of me. I pulled out my map, but it was useless. The landmarks I usually relied on were hidden, swallowed by the mist. I had no idea how far I'd gone, or how much farther I had to go to get back to the trailhead. Then I heard it again, the sound of something moving, directly behind me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight beam cut through the fog, bouncing off the wet bark of the trees, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive grey mist hanging heavy in the air. And then the smell hit me. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A rank, musky odor, like wet fur and decay. It clung to the air, thick and nauseating, filling my nostrils. I gagged, covering my mouth, my eyes watering from the stench. Whatever was out there, it was close. Too close. I broke into a jog, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the fog swirling around me as I moved. The trail was barely visible now, just a faint suggestion of dirt beneath my feet. I didn't care anymore. I just needed to keep moving, to get away from whatever was out there. But the faster I ran, the louder the sound became, the crunch of branches, the heavy footfalls of something massive keeping pace with me. It wasn't my imagination anymore. It was real, and it was getting closer. I rounded a bend in the trail, my lungs burning, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the path ahead, tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark, matted fur. My legs froze mid-stride, and I stumbled to a stop, my chest heaving as I stared at the thing blocking my way. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an elk. It stood upright, towering over me, its long arms hanging at its sides, its head tilted slightly as if it were watching me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them on me, piercing through the fog. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. The fog swirled lazily between us, thick and heavy, and the smell of wet fur and rot was overwhelming now, making my stomach churn. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move, locked in place by fear. The creature shifted then, its body moving with a slow, deliberate grace. It took one step toward me, the ground beneath its massive foot crunching loudly in the silence. That broke the spell. I turned and ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. The fog blurred around me as I sprinted down the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I heard the heavy footfalls again, matching my pace, gaining on me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep moving, to not stop, not for anything. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I pushed harder, faster. I could hear the creature behind me, closer now, its breath coming in heavy, ragged bursts. Just when I thought I couldn't run any farther, the fog began to lift. Slowly at first, but then all at once. The trees around me became clearer, the trail more defined. I could see the outline of the parking lot ahead, just a few 100 feet away. I pushed myself harder, my legs trembling with exhaustion, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst out of the fog and into the open, my body shaking with adrenaline. The parking lot was empty, my car sitting there like a lifeline. I threw myself into the driver's seat, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until I was miles away, the fog far behind me, that I allowed myself to breathe again. My heart was still racing, my body drenched in sweat, but I was alive. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been following me, it hadn't caught me, not this time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting in the fog for its next chance. And I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't going back to those mountains, ever again. Story 4. I used to think that monsters only existed in movies and campfire stories. That was before that night in the Cascade Mountains. Now, I'm not so sure what to believe anymore. My name's Mike Carlson, and this is the story of how a simple camping trip turned into the most terrifying night of my life. It was supposed to be a guys' weekend. Just me and my best friend Jason getting away from the city for a few days. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to explore a remote area of the Cascades, known for its pristine wilderness, and, if the local legends were to be believed, occasional Sasquatch sightings. Now, don't get me wrong, we didn't actually believe in Bigfoot, at least not then. We just thought it would add a fun element of spookiness to our adventure. You know, something to joke about around the campfire. We set out early on a crisp Friday morning in late September. The drive up into the mountains was beautiful, all winding roads and stunning vistas. As we climbed higher, the forests grew denser, the trees pressing in close on either side of the narrow dirt road. "Man, this is really out there," Jason said, peering through the windshield at the thick canopy overhead. "You sure you know where we're going?" I nodded, though I was starting to have my doubts. We'd deliberately chosen a spot off the beaten path, but this felt like we were driving to the edge of the world. Finally, after what seemed like hours of bumping along increasingly rough roads, we reached our destination, a small clearing nestled between towering pines. We parked the car and started setting up camp, the excitement of being out in the wilderness pushing away any lingering concerns about our isolated location. As the sun began to set, we got a fire going and cracked open a couple of beers. The night was clear, the stars coming out in force above us. It was peaceful in a way that city life never is. The only sounds, the crackling of our fire and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. "So," Jason said, a mischievous glint in his eye, "you think we'll see any Sasquatches out here?" I laughed, taking a swig of my beer. "Sure, buddy. Maybe we'll invite one over for s'mores." We spent the next hour or so trading increasingly ridiculous Bigfoot stories, each trying to outdo the other. As the night wore on and our fire burned low, we decided to turn in. We doused the fire and retreated to our tent, the darkness of the forest suddenly seeming much more oppressive without the cheerful flames. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I was jolted awake by a sound. At first I couldn't place it, a sort of deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. For a moment, I thought it might be thunder, but the sky had been clear when we went to bed, and besides, this sound was different, more primal. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding, straining my ears. There it was again, a low, guttural sound that was definitely not thunder, and it was close. "Jason," I whispered, reaching out to shake my friend awake. "Jason, wake up! Do you hear that?" Jason stirred, mumbling something incoherent, but before I could shake him again, another sound cut through the night, the sharp crack of a branch breaking, as if under a heavy weight. That woke Jason up. He sat bolt upright, his eyes wide in the dim light filtering through the tent fabric. "What was that?" he hissed. I put a finger to my lips, gesturing for him to be quiet. We sat there, barely breathing, listening intently. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush around our campsite. Whatever it was big. We could hear branches snapping and leaves rustling as it moved, and it wasn't just passing through. The sounds seemed to circle our tent, as if the creature was investigating us. "It's probably just a bear," Jason whispered, but his voice trembled with uncertainty. I wanted to believe him. Bears we could handle. We'd taken all the proper precautions, storing our food away from the campsite, but something about this felt different. Wrong. Suddenly, a shadow fell across our tent, something huge, blocking out what little moonlight had been filtering through. We both froze, hardly daring to breathe. I could hear a deep, rhythmic sound, breathing. Whatever was out there, it was right next to our tent. The shadow moved, and for a split second I could have sworn I saw the silhouette of something that walked on two legs. But that was impossible. Bears don't walk upright, not like that. Then came a sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. A deep, rumbling vocalization that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a growl or a roar or anything I could attribute to any animal I knew. It was almost speech-like, but not quite human. Jason and I exchanged terrified glances. This was no bear. This was something else entirely. The creature circled our tent once more, its footsteps heavy enough to make the ground vibrate slightly. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it moved away. We heard it crashing through the underbrush, the sounds growing fainter until they faded into the night. For what felt like hours, we sat there in silence, too scared to move or speak. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the forest around us made us jump. As the first light of dawn began to seep into the sky, we finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and peer outside. The clearing looked undisturbed at first glance, but as we cautiously emerged from the tent, we noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth around our campsite, were footprints. But these weren't bear tracks or any other animal print I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, and distinctly bipedal. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever had made them was incredibly heavy. "Mike," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell made these?" I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was racing, trying to come up with any rational explanation for what we'd experienced, but I kept coming back to one impossible conclusion. We broke camp in record time, barely speaking as we packed up our gear. The light-hearted mood of the previous evening was gone, replaced by a tense silence. We both knew what we'd heard, what we'd seen, but neither of us wanted to be the first to say it out loud. As we drove back down the mountain, the morning sun painting the trees in golden light, Jason finally broke the silence. "It was real, wasn't it?" he said quietly. "All those stories. They're true." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "I don't know what it was," I replied, "but it was definitely something." We've tried to rationalize that night many times since then. Maybe it was an elaborate prank, or some kind of mass hallucination brought on by fear and isolation, but deep down, we both know the truth. There's something out there in those mountains, something that isn't supposed to exist. And for one terrifying night, we came face to face with it. We never went camping again after that. The thought of being out in the wilderness, vulnerable and exposed, is too much to bear. Sometimes, when the wind howls outside my window at night, I'm transported back to that tent, feeling the presence of something ancient and unknowable just beyond the thin fabric walls. I've never told this story publicly before. Who would believe it? But I know what I experienced that night. And I know that somewhere out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, there are things that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and civilization, we're not as far removed from the primal world as we'd like to believe. So the next time you're out in the woods and you hear a strange sound in the night or feel like you're being watched, remember our story. And remember that not all legends are just stories. Some of them are warnings. Story 5. It was just after midnight when we heard the first knock, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud against the quiet of the forest. Lisa and I exchanged a glance across the dimly lit cabin, the soft crackling of the fire, the only other sound. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, no one should have been knocking. Certainly not at this hour, not in these woods. We had driven up to the cabin for a weekend away, just the two of us. It was Lisa's idea, actually. She'd found this place online, remote, cozy, and supposedly perfect for disconnecting. I didn't need much convincing. After the relentless pace of work for the past few months, the idea of getting away from everything, of just us in a cabin in the northern Minnesota woods, sounded like heaven. The drive up had been peaceful. The farther we got from the city, the more relaxed we both became. The trees thickened, the roads narrowed, and by the time we arrived at the cabin, the silence of the forest felt like a blanket, soft and comforting. The cabin itself was small but charming. A little worn around the edges, maybe, but it had everything we needed: running water, a wood-burning stove, and the promise of uninterrupted solitude. There were no neighbors for miles, no cell service, no distractions. Just the two of us, and the vast stretch of wilderness surrounding us. By the time night fell, a heavy fog had settled over the forest, rolling in like an ocean of mist, swallowing everything outside the cabin walls. The woods, once alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, had gone eerily silent. But I didn't think much of it at the time. The fire was going. We had a couple of glasses of wine, and the flickering glow from the fireplace made the whole cabin feel warm and safe. That first knock shattered the illusion. It wasn't a casual knock. It was deliberate, loud, like someone was using the side of their fist to hit the door. The sound echoed through the cabin, sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. Lisa's eyes widened, and I saw her tense up in her chair. "What the hell?" she whispered. I stood, my heart already thudding in my chest, and grabbed the flashlight from the table. The front door was solid wood, no windows, and the small cabin windows along the walls didn't offer much of a view into the thick fog outside. Whoever or whatever had knocked, there was no way they'd just wandered up here by accident. I hesitated for a moment before walking toward the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My mind raced. Could it be someone lost? Maybe a hiker, or someone from another cabin we didn't know about? I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, but none of them felt right. There was no other cabin out here. Another knock, harder this time, more urgent. "Tom?" Lisa's voice was strained. Maybe don't open it." I didn't plan on opening it, not until I knew what was on the other side. Instead, I leaned forward, pressing my ear against the door, straining to hear anything beyond the solid wood. Silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I clicked on the flashlight and slowly slid open the curtain of the small window next to the door. My beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but swirling mist and the dark outline of the trees beyond the porch. No figure, no shadow, nothing. Whoever knocked wasn't there anymore. "Is anyone out there?" I called, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. Nothing answered, not even the usual sounds of the forest. The silence was absolute. Lisa stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. She wasn't usually jumpy, but I could see the fear creeping in, the way her eyes darted around the cabin like she was expecting something to come crashing through the windows at any second. "Do you see anything?" she asked. "No," I muttered, stepping back from the window. "But it's weird. There's no one." "I don't like this," Lisa said, moving closer to me. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "What if it's someone messing with us? Or—" Another knock, louder. This time it wasn't just a knock, it was a fist pounding on the door, so hard I felt it reverberate through the floorboards. My stomach dropped. Whoever was out there wasn't lost, and they weren't friendly. That much was clear. I backed away from the door, my heart racing, my brain scrambling for what to do next. Do I confront whoever it is? What if they're dangerous? But then again, just staying inside and waiting for whatever was out there to make the next move seemed like a worse idea. Lisa's face was pale, her hands gripping her arms tightly. "Tom, what is that?" "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Just stay back, okay?" I looked around the cabin, searching for something, anything that could give me an edge. There was a rusty hatchet hanging by the fireplace, meant for chopping wood, I guessed. Not much, but better than nothing. I grabbed it, feeling the weight in my hand, trying to ignore how absurdly inadequate it felt. I moved back to the door, gripping the handle of the hatchet tightly. If they knocked again, I'd open the door. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to know what was out there. I couldn't just sit in here waiting for it to break in. A long stretch of silence passed. The only sound was the crackling of the fire behind me and the heavy fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. I glanced at Lisa, who was standing frozen in place, her eyes wide and fixed on the door. Then, suddenly, a different sound, a scraping, like nails dragging down the side of the cabin. Slowly, deliberately, as if whatever was out there wanted us to know it was still close. My breath caught in my throat. I moved toward the window again, flashlight at the ready. This time, I didn't wait. I threw the curtain aside and aimed the beam into the fog. My heart lurched into my throat. There, just beyond the edge of the porch, was a figure, tall, thin, gaunt, its outline barely visible through the swirling mist, but unmistakable. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural. The way it stood, hunched slightly forward, as if it was waiting. "Lisa," I whispered, my voice trembling, "get away from the door." She didn't hesitate. She moved back to the center of the cabin, her back to the fireplace, eyes fixed on me as I stood by the window. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, in the fog, its pale, hollow face barely visible now through the beam of my flashlight. No features, just an empty, sunken mask of skin. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. I backed away from the window, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to get out. But where would we go? We were miles from anyone, from anything. "Tom?" Lisa's voice was barely audible, shaky with fear. I swallowed hard. "There's something out there." "What do you mean?" Her voice cracked. "What is it?" "I don't know," I said, the words catching in my throat. "But it's not a person." Another scrape, this time louder, closer, as if the thing outside was dragging its nails along the side of the cabin, inching toward the door. I clenched the hatchet tighter, my knuckles white. "We need to stay inside," I said. "We can't open the door." Lisa nodded, her eyes wide with fear. She stepped closer to me, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone, useless without a signal. We stood there staring at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next move. But none came. The scraping stopped. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable. The fire crackled behind us, but it offered no comfort. The thing outside could still be there, watching, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, before the tension eased just a fraction. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the silence oppressive, the fog never lifting. We didn't speak. We barely breathed. We just stood there, waiting. And then, just as the faintest hint of dawn began to break through the fog, there was one final knock. Soft this time, almost gentle, as if the thing outside was letting us know it hadn't left. It was still there, and it could come back any time it wanted. The cabin no longer felt safe. Story 6. I always thought I was prepared for anything the wilderness could throw at me. Years of solo hiking had given me a false sense of security, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that remote trail in the Appalachian Mountains. It was the day I learned that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. My name is Emily Hawkins, and this is the story of the hike that changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on what was supposed to be a challenging but routine day hike. The Hollow Creek Trail was known for its rugged terrain and spectacular views, perfect for an experienced hiker looking to push their limits. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, eager to tackle one of the most isolated trails in the area. As I shouldered my pack and set off down the trail, the early morning mist was just starting to lift, revealing glimpses of the vibrant fall foliage. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was the kind of day that reminded me why I loved hiking so much. Just me and the wilderness, miles from the nearest sign of civilization. The first few hours were everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound its way up steep inclines and along narrow ridges, each turn revealing a new, breathtaking vista. I stopped occasionally to catch my breath and take photos, marveling at the sea of red and gold that stretched out below me. It was around midday when I first got the feeling that something was off. I'd just rounded a bend in the trail when I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I paused, scanning the woods around me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just trees and underbrush, stirring slightly in the breeze. I shook off the feeling and continued on, but I couldn't quite shake the sense of unease that had settled over me. The forest seemed quieter now, The usual chorus of birdsong and rustling leaves muted. As the afternoon wore on, the feeling only intensified. More than once, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. I tried to rationalize it. Probably just a deer or a raccoon, I told myself, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was something else entirely. I picked up my pace, suddenly eager to reach the end of the trail and return to my car. The sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the path. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement between the trees, too large and too quick to be any normal forest animal. My heart began to race as I caught a glimpse of a dark, fur-covered form moving parallel to the trail. It was walking on two legs, but its gait was all wrong for a human. Its arms were too long, its shoulders too broad. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt, but this was no bear. As the creature paused, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, I could make out more details. It stood well over 7 feet tall, its body covered in coarse, dark fur. But it was the face that sent a chill down my spine, a bizarre mix of canine and human features with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. Our gazes locked for a split second, and in that moment I knew that this was no costume, no hoax. This was something that shouldn't exist, something that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the shadows of the forest, but I knew it wasn't gone. I could feel its presence, moving parallel to the trail, always just out of sight. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was miles from any help, in one of the most isolated areas of the park. Night was falling, and I was being stalked by something straight out of a nightmare. I broke into a run, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine as I tore down the trail. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh spike of terror through me. I could hear it moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with me effortlessly. As I ran, my mind raced through everything I'd ever heard about encounters with unknown creatures. Dogman, some called them, werewolf-like beings spotted in remote areas across the country. I'd always dismissed such stories as campfire tales or mistaken identities. Now I was living one. The trail seemed endless, each bend revealing only more forest stretching out ahead of me. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear drove me onward. The creature seemed to be toying with me, sometimes falling back, only to surge forward again, always staying just out of clear sight. As the last light faded from the sky, I realized I had a choice to make. I couldn't outrun this thing, not in the dark, not on this unfamiliar trail. I needed to find shelter, somewhere I could defend myself until daylight. Up ahead, I spotted a formation of large boulders jutting out from the hillside. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option I had. I veered off the trail, scrambling up the rocky slope. My hands were scraped and bleeding by the time I wedged myself into a narrow crevice between two of the largest boulders. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the surrounding forest and the trail below. I pulled out my flashlight, flicking it on and scanning the trees. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence and stillness. Then I saw it. The creature emerged from the tree line, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. It moved with an unnatural grace, its head swiveling as it searched for me. I held my breath, pressing myself further back into the crevice, praying that the shadows would conceal me. The creature paused at the base of the boulder formation, lifting its head to sniff the air. A low, rumbling growl emanated from its throat, a sound that vibrated through the very rock I was pressed against. Slowly, it began to climb. I clutched my bear spray, knowing it would probably be useless against this thing, but needing something, anything to defend myself with. The scrape of claws on rock grew louder as the creature ascended, drawing nearer to my hiding place. Just as I thought it was about to discover me, a sound rang out through the night. the distant but unmistakable bark of a dog. The creature froze, its head whipping around towards the source of the noise. Another bark followed, then another. Someone was on the trail, probably a search party sent out when I didn't return on time. The creature let out a frustrated growl, but it was moving away now, melting back into the shadows of the forest. I wanted to call out to my potential rescuers, but fear kept me silent. What if the creature was still lurking nearby? What if I drew it back? I stayed hidden in that crevice all night, shivering with cold and fear, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I finally worked up the courage to emerge from my hiding place. The forest looked normal in the pale morning light, peaceful even. But I knew what was out there now, knew that the wilderness held secrets darker and stranger than I'd ever imagined. I made my way back to the trail on shaky legs, and it wasn't long before I encountered the search party, a pair of park rangers and their search dog. They were relieved to find me, commenting on how lucky I was to have survived a night out in the wilderness alone. If only they knew. I didn't tell them about what I'd seen. How could I? They'd think I was crazy, or that I'd hallucinated from exhaustion and fear. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there. I haven't gone hiking since that day. The thought of being out in the wilderness, vulnerable and exposed, sends me into a panic. Sometimes when the wind howls outside my window at night, I'm transported back to that trail, feeling the presence of something ancient and unknowable tracking me through the darkness. I've tried to research what I encountered, spending countless hours reading about cryptid sightings and unexplained phenomena. There are others out there who've seen similar things, I've learned. But knowing I'm not alone in my experience brings little comfort, because now I know the truth, that the line between the world we know and the world we don't is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes, when we venture into the wild places of the earth, we catch glimpses of things that were never meant to be seen. So the next time you're out in the woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust your instincts, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. And remember, not all trails lead back to safety. Some lead us into the heart of mysteries we may never fully understand. Story 7. The moment I heard the howl, sharp and too close for comfort, I knew I wasn't alone in the woods anymore. I had been tracking deer all morning, moving silently through the underbrush, but now the forest was different. The usual sounds, the birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, had all stopped. And as the echo of that howl faded, a chill ran down my spine. Something was out here with me, something I hadn't counted on. I've been hunting these woods in Colorado for years, ever since I was a kid, and I thought I knew every trail, every clearing, and every ridge. There's a rhythm to these mountains, a way they breathe with the seasons, and after so many trips, you start to feel in tune with it. I usually come up here alone, just me, my rifle, and the quiet peace of the wilderness. It's the one place where I can clear my head, away from the noise of the world. That morning had started like any other. I woke up before dawn, packed my gear, and set off on foot. The air was crisp, biting against my skin, but not cold enough to make me uncomfortable. I could see my breath in the early light as I moved through the pines, my eyes scanning for signs of deer tracks. It wasn't long before I found some. A small herd had passed through not long before, their hoofprints still fresh in the damp earth. I followed the trail deeper into the woods, keeping my pace steady, my rifle slung across my shoulder. The sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows through the trees, and I felt that familiar sense of focus, of being in the hunt. It wasn't until I reached the ridge that things started to feel off. I was crouched down, studying the tracks, when the first howl ripped through the air. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before, not a coyote, not a wolf. It was deeper, more guttural, and it carried an edge that set my teeth on edge. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, my hand instinctively going to my rifle. For a few seconds, I just listened, the echo of the howl lingering in the air. The forest had gone unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the wind maybe, but deep down I knew better. Something was out there, and it wasn't far. I stood slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line, the rifle now in my hands. I'd been out in these woods enough times to trust my instincts, and right now, my instincts were screaming at me to be cautious. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pushed forward, trying to shake off the unease, but I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The tracks I'd been following were still fresh, but something told me I wasn't the only one hunting out here. That howl, it felt like a warning. Another half-hour passed, and I found myself at the edge of a wide, open clearing. I stopped just inside the tree line, crouching low, scanning the area. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation, and then there it was again. Another howl, this time closer, too close. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the rifle tighter. This time I knew it wasn't a trick of the wind. The sound was deliberate, like something was calling out, announcing its presence, and I was in its territory. I stood up slowly, my eyes darting between the trees, looking for any sign of movement. The clearing stretched out before me, bathed in the soft light of the early afternoon, but something about it felt wrong. It was too open, too exposed, and then I saw it, a flash of movement at the far edge of the clearing, just within the shadows of the trees. I raised my rifle, my pulse quickening. Whatever it was big, moving low to the ground, with a kind of grace that didn't match its size. I caught a glimpse of fur, dark and matted, but it disappeared before I could get a clear look. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed up a step, my mind racing. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer, this was something else. I stayed low, my eyes locked on the spot where I'd seen the movement. My finger hovered over the trigger, but I didn't fire. Not yet. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, and the last thing I wanted was to provoke it. For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest remained still, the only sound my own shallow breathing. And then, slowly, the thing emerged from the shadows. At first I thought it was a wolf, but wolves don't get that big. Its head was massive, its shoulders broad and hunched, and it moved with an almost human-like intelligence. Its fur was thick and black, its eyes glinting in the light as it stared at me from across the clearing. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'd dealt with predators before, but this was different. It wasn't acting like an animal. It was watching me, studying me, as if it was weighing its options. My heart pounded in my ears as I slowly lifted my rifle, aiming squarely at the creature's chest. My hands were shaking, but I steadied my breathing, my finger pressing lightly on the trigger. I didn't want to shoot unless I had to, but I wasn't taking any chances. The creature took a step closer, and that was enough for me. I squeezed the trigger, the rifle kicking hard against my shoulder as the shot rang out. The sound echoed through the clearing, startling a flock of birds from the nearby trees. For a split second I thought I'd hit it, but the thing barely flinched. It let out a low, rumbling growl, its eyes narrowing as it stared me down. My heart sank. I backed up another step, trying to put distance between us, but the creature moved faster than I expected. It lunged toward me, crossing the clearing in a matter of seconds, its powerful limbs carrying it with terrifying speed. I fired again, but the shot went wide. Panic surged through me as I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the earth as I sprinted toward the tree line. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, gaining on me with every second. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed harder, desperate to put distance between us. The trees blurred around me as I barreled through the forest, my heart hammering in my chest. I could still hear it, closer now, its growls growing louder, more aggressive. It was toying with me, keeping pace but not closing the distance completely, as if it was waiting for me to tire out. I stumbled over a root, nearly losing my footing, but I managed to stay upright, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cabin wasn't far. If I could just make it there, I had a chance. The growls grew louder, and I pushed myself harder, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The trees thinned out ahead, and I caught a glimpse of the cabin through the gaps in the branches. Relief surged through me, but I didn't slow down. I burst out of the trees and onto the narrow dirt path leading to the cabin. I could hear the creature behind me, crashing through the underbrush, but I didn't dare look back. I threw myself toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the latch. I slammed the door shut, just as the creature hit it with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. The whole cabin shook, the windows rattling in their frames. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my heart racing. For a moment, there was silence. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and desperate, as I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the rifle tightly in my hands. Then, slowly, the growling started again, low and rumbling, just outside the door. The creature scratched at the wood, testing it, as if it knew I was trapped inside. I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on me. I backed up further, my eyes locked on the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know how long the cabin would hold, or if the creature would try to force its way in. All I knew was that I wasn't safe. Not yet. The scratching stopped, and for a long moment there was nothing. No growls, no movement, just an eerie, suffocating silence. I stood there frozen, listening, waiting. My breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, and my hands were slick with sweat, the rifle trembling in my grip. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting, and I realized with a jolt that the creature had retreated. But I knew it wasn't over, not really. It was still out there, waiting, and next time I wouldn't be so lucky. Story 8. I've been a hunter all my life, but nothing could have prepared me for that day in the woods. The day when I realized that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. My name is Tom Whitaker, and this is the story of the hunt that changed everything. It was a crisp October morning when I set out into the familiar forests of northern Michigan, the kind of day hunters dream about, cool enough for the deer to be moving, but not so cold that sitting in a blind would be unbearable. The trees were a riot of red and gold, and the air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke from distant cabins. I'd been tracking a particularly large buck for weeks, catching glimpses of him on my trail cameras. Today, I was determined to bring him down. Little did I know, I wasn't the only predator in these woods, with my eye on a prize. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I moved quietly through the underbrush, my trusted rifle slung over my shoulder. The forest was alive with the usual sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the occasional rustle of a small animal moving through the leaves. It was around midday when I came across something that made me pause. There, in a small clearing, was a deer carcass. Now, finding a dead deer isn't unusual in itself, but this was different. As I approached, I could see that the carcass had been torn apart in a way I'd never seen before. It wasn't the clean kill of a hunter, or even the messy work of a bear or wolf pack. The deer looked like it had been ripped limb from limb, its flesh torn away in great chunks. The ground around it was soaked with blood, much more than you'd typically see from a normal predator kill. I knelt down to examine it more closely, my hand instinctively tightening on my rifle. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first glance, they looked almost like bear prints, but something was off. They were bigger than any bear tracks I'd ever seen, and the shape was all wrong. The pad was too elongated, and there were clear claw marks at the end of each toe, longer and sharper than a bear's. A chill ran down my spine as I studied those tracks. In all my years of hunting, I'd never seen anything like them. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and they were fresh. I stood up slowly, suddenly very aware of how quiet the forest had become. The birds had stopped singing, the squirrels had gone silent. It was as if the entire woods was holding its breath. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was deeper than a bear's growl, more guttural, almost human, but not quite. My heart began to race as I scanned the tree line. There, just at the edge of the clearing, I caught a flash of movement. Something large and dark slipped behind a thick oak tree, something that moved on two legs. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking slightly as I peered through the scope. For a long moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from behind the tree. What I saw through that scope defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It stood well over 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur. But it wasn't the size that terrified me. It was the face, a bizarre mix of wolf and human features, with eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that had no place in an animal. Our gazes locked, and in that moment I knew that I was no longer the hunter. I was prey. The creature let out a roar that shook the very air around me. Without thinking, I fired. The shot rang out through the forest, but the creature was already moving. It was fast, impossibly fast for something of its size. I turned and ran, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with every second. The forest that I knew so well suddenly seemed alien and hostile, every tree and bush a potential hiding place for the monster on my heels. As I ran, my mind raced through everything I'd ever heard about encounters with unknown creatures. Wendigo, some of the old-timers called them, mythical beasts of Native American lore said to stalk the northern forests. I'd always dismissed such stories as campfire tales. Now I was living one. I burst out of the tree line into a small meadow, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. That's when the smell hit me, a powerful, musky odor that made my eyes water. It was close, too close. I spun around, raising my rifle just as the creature emerged from the woods. It paused at the edge of the meadow, its massive chest heaving as it fixed me with those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. For a moment, we stood there, hunter and hunted, locked in a standoff. I knew my rifle was useless. Even if I managed to hit it, I doubted a single shot would bring down something that size. But it was all I had. The creature took a step forward, and I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the uneven ground. It let out another of those bone-chilling roars, displaying a mouthful of teeth that put any wolves to shame. That's when I heard it, the distant sound of an ATV engine. The creature's head snapped toward the noise, its ears twitching. It let out a frustrated growl, glancing back at me with what I could have sworn was regret. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and loped back into the forest. I stood there, my rifle still raised, shaking from head to toe as I watched it disappear into the shadows of the trees. Minutes later, a pair of conservation officers on ATVs broke through the tree line. They'd been patrolling the area and heard my shot. They found me still standing there, pale and trembling, my eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had vanished. I didn't tell them what I'd seen. How could I? They'd think I was crazy, or that I'd been sampling my hip flask a bit too liberally. But I knew what I'd encountered. I knew what was out there. The officers escorted me back to my truck, commenting on how lucky I was. A bear, they assumed, or maybe a particularly aggressive wolf. If only they knew. I haven't been hunting since that day. The thought of being out in those woods, of being the prey rather than the predator, is more than I can bear. Sometimes, when the wind howls around my cabin at night, I'm transported back to that meadow, feeling the hot breath of that creature on the back of my neck. I've spent countless hours researching what I saw, poring over books on cryptozoology and Native American legends. There are others out there who've had similar encounters, I've learned, but knowing I'm not alone brings little comfort. because now I know the truth, that the wilderness holds secrets darker and stranger than we can imagine, that there are things out there that defy explanation, things that turn the tables on those who fancy themselves the top of the food chain. So the next time you're out in the woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust your instincts, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And remember, not all hunters walk on two legs. Some of them are far older, far more dangerous than anything we've put a name to. Some of them are the stuff of nightmares, walking in broad daylight. As for me, I'll stick to telling my story to those who'll listen, a cautionary tale for those who think they know all there is to know about the wild. Because if there's one thing I learned that day, it's that nature always has one more surprise up its sleeve, and sometimes that surprise has teeth. Story 9. At first it looked like a person, just someone walking down the trail behind us, a little too far to make out any details, but close enough to feel wrong. There was something off about the way they moved, something that made my skin crawl, even though I couldn't explain why. My instincts were telling me one thing: don't let them get any closer. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. Amanda and I had been planning this trip to the Utah mountains for weeks. No phones, no work, just us and the open trail. I'd been to the area a few times before, and I knew the landscape well. The rugged beauty of the red rocks, the vast open sky, and the feeling of complete isolation were exactly what we needed. That morning, everything felt perfect. The sun was climbing over the horizon as we packed up our gear and hit the trail. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and dust swirling together as we walked through the sagebrush. We were miles from any towns, any roads, exactly where I wanted to be. We were 2 hours into the hike when I noticed the figure. We had just finished a steep climb, the trail winding through a narrow canyon with towering cliffs on either side. I was catching my breath, taking a swig of water when I glanced back down the trail and saw someone behind us. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out their face, just a dark silhouette moving slowly, methodically. "Hey," I said, nudging Amanda. "You see that?" She turned and squinted into the distance. "Yeah, probably just another hiker." "Maybe," I muttered, but something didn't sit right. We hadn't seen anyone else all morning. In fact, we hadn't seen anyone since we arrived at the trailhead the day before. Most people didn't hike this far out. The remoteness was part of the appeal for me, but now it felt like something else entirely. Amanda shrugged, clearly unconcerned, and we kept walking. I tried to shake the unease, but every now and then I'd glance back and see the figure still there, moving steadily in our direction, never speeding up, but never falling too far behind either. By mid-afternoon, we'd reached a small clearing where the trail split into 2 different paths. It was a good spot to rest and get our bearings. Amanda was already sitting on a rock, digging into her backpack for snacks, when I checked the trail behind us again. The figure was closer now. They were still too far away to see any details. Just that same dark outline, the strange, jerky way they moved, like their limbs were too long for their body. It was unsettling, but I didn't want to freak Amanda out. Instead, I sat down next to her, pretending to be calm. "Do you think it's weird?" she asked suddenly, like she'd been reading my mind. I looked over at her. "What?" "That person. They've been following us all day, haven't they?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's nothing. Could just be someone on the same trail. But why haven't they caught up to us, or slowed down? It's like they're keeping the same distance no matter what." Her words made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She was right. It didn't make sense. Most hikers would either catch up to us, or we'd lose them if we moved faster, but this person, they were always just far enough away to keep us in sight, like they were deliberately keeping their distance. "Let's take the other trail," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Might throw them off." Amanda didn't argue. We packed up quickly and headed down the left fork, a narrower, rockier path that wound through a series of small canyons. It wasn't as well traveled, and after a few minutes, I felt my muscles relax slightly. The walls of the canyon closed in around us, blocking the view of the trail behind. For a while it worked. The figure disappeared from view, and with each step, I felt a little less on edge. We didn't talk much, just focused on the trail ahead, our boots crunching against the gravel as we navigated the twists and turns. Then, after about an hour, we heard it. A sharp, animalistic scream echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the walls and surrounding us from all sides. It wasn't the sound of any animal I'd ever heard, too high-pitched, too human-like, but wrong in some way I couldn't explain. Amanda froze beside me, her eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, my heart racing. "Coyote, maybe?" But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. I've heard coyotes plenty of times. This wasn't one of them. We stood there for a moment listening, but the scream didn't come again. Just the wind through the canyon, the distant sound of rocks shifting. Forcing myself to stay calm, I motioned for Amanda to keep moving. There wasn't much else we could do, and standing around wasn't going to make us feel any safer. We walked faster now, almost jogging in some places, eager to put more distance between us and whatever made that sound. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to reappear, but the trail behind us remained empty. After another mile or so, we reached the top of a small ridge, and I allowed myself to believe that we'd lost them. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape, and I figured if we kept going at this pace, we'd make it back to camp by nightfall. That's when I saw it again. Standing at the base of the ridge, far below us, was the same figure. This time it was closer than before, close enough for me to make out the unnatural way it moved. It wasn't walking anymore. It was on all fours, its limbs contorted and twisted in ways that no human body should bend. "Oh my God!" Amanda whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth had gone dry, and all I could do was stare as the thing began to climb, scrambling up the ridge with an eerie, inhuman speed. It didn't make a sound, no panting, no grunts of exertion, just the scrape of its limbs against the rocks as it closed the distance between us. "Run," I finally managed to say, grabbing Amanda's hand and pulling her down the other side of the ridge. We bolted, our legs burning as we sprinted down the narrow path, dodging rocks and ducking under low branches. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare slow down, not even for a second. I could hear it behind us, the sound of its claws scraping against the ground, getting closer and closer. Amanda stumbled, nearly falling, but I caught her arm and yanked her forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Come on, don't stop!" We reached a bend in the trail, and I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the thing right on our heels. But it had stopped. It stood there just a few yards away, crouched low to the ground, its hollow eyes fixed on us. It was waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. But I wasn't about to stick around and find out. We kept running, the trail blurring around us as the sun sank lower in the sky, casting everything in an eerie orange glow. The canyon walls closed in again, and soon we were in near darkness, the only light coming from the sliver of sky above us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of the canyon, and the trail opened up into a wide, flat expanse of desert. Our campsite was just ahead, the small tent a welcome sight after the nightmare we'd just been through. We didn't stop running until we reached the tent, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. For a long time, we just sat there, the quiet desert air pressing in around us. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with what had just happened, but when I finally turned to Amanda, her face pale and eyes wide with fear, I knew we both had the same thought. We weren't safe, not yet. because whatever had been following us, whatever was out there, it wasn't gone, and something told me it would be back. Story 10. We thought we'd found the perfect spot for a family day out. Little did we know we'd stumbled into something's territory, something that wasn't going to share its space willingly. I'm Maria Rodriguez, and this is the story of the day our picnic turned into a nightmare. It was a beautiful Saturday in late spring when we decided to take the kids on a picnic. My husband Carlos and I had been promising our 2 children, Sophia, 8, and Miguel, 6, a day out in nature for weeks. We'd heard about this secluded spot just off one of the lesser-known trails in Oakwood State Park, a little clearing by a stream that sounded perfect for a family outing. The morning was bright and clear as we packed up our minivan with all the essentials, a big picnic basket filled with sandwiches, fruit, and Sophia's favorite chocolate chip cookies, a cooler with drinks, and a few outdoor games. The kids were buzzing with excitement, chattering about the animals they hoped to see and the rocks they wanted to collect from the stream. The drive to the park was uneventful, filled with our usual family banter and the kids' favorite songs playing on the radio. As we turned onto the narrow road leading deeper into the park, I couldn't help but notice how the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the road. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked Carlos, a hint of uncertainty creeping into my voice. He nodded, his eyes focused on the winding road ahead. "Yeah, the ranger at the entrance said to follow this road to the end. The trailhead should be right there." Sure enough, after about 15 minutes of driving, we came to a small parking area at the end of the road. There were no other cars there, which surprised me a little. I'd expected such a nice spot to be more popular. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," Carlos said with a grin as we started unloading our gear. The trail was narrow but well marked, winding through the dense forest. The kids ran ahead, pointing out interesting plants and bugs, while Carlos and I followed with our arms full of picnic supplies. The sound of running water grew louder as we walked, and after about 20 minutes we emerged into a beautiful clearing. It was like something out of a storybook. A small, clear stream bubbled over rocks on one side of the clearing, while wildflowers dotted the lush grass. The trees around the edge seemed to form a natural barrier, giving the place a cozy, secluded feel. "It's perfect," I breathed, already envisioning where we'd set up our picnic. We spread out our blanket in a sunny spot near the stream, and soon we were all enjoying our sandwiches and the peaceful sounds of nature. Sophia and Miguel finished eating quickly and asked if they could explore a little. "Stay where we can see you," Carlos called as they scampered off towards the edge of the clearing. For a while, everything was idyllic. Carlos and I relaxed on the blanket, watching the kids play and listening to the soothing sound of the stream. But as the afternoon wore on, I started to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like we were being watched. I scanned the tree line, trying to shake off the feeling. That's when I noticed how quiet it had become. The bird songs and insect buzzing that had filled the air earlier had faded away, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the sound of the stream and our children's distant laughter. "Carlos," I said softly, not wanting to alarm the kids. "Does something feel off to you?" He looked up from the book he'd been reading, his brow furrowing as he took in our surroundings. "Now that you mention it, it does seem awfully quiet." Just then, Sophia and Miguel came running back to the blanket, their eyes wide with excitement. "Mama, Papa!" Sophia exclaimed. "We saw something in the bushes, something big." My heart rate quickened. "What do you mean, mija? What did it look like?" Miguel piped up. "It was furry, and it had red eyes." Carlos and I exchanged worried glances. "I'm sure it was just a deer," Carlos said, trying to sound reassuring, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, but certainly not human. The kids huddled close to us, suddenly frightened. I scanned the edge of the clearing frantically, my eyes straining to catch any sign of movement. For a long moment, there was nothing but tense silence. Then I saw them, a pair of glowing red eyes peering out from the shadows between two large oak trees. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest animal, and they gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. "Carlos," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Look." He followed my gaze, and I felt him stiffen beside me. Slowly, carefully, he stood up, positioning himself between our family and those watching eyes. "Kids," he said in a low, calm voice that belied the fear I could see in his eyes, "I want you to very quietly help Mama pack up our things. We're going to head back to the car now." Sofia and Miguel, sensing the tension, didn't argue. We began hastily shoving our picnic supplies back into the basket and cooler, all the while keeping a wary eye on the tree line. The eyes had disappeared, but I could hear movement in the underbrush now, the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was circling the clearing. We had just finished packing when a dark shape emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing. In the fading afternoon light, I couldn't make out details, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It was large, larger than a bear, and walked on two legs in a way that was almost, but not quite, human. "Run," Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now!" We didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing the kids' hands, we took off towards the trail, our picnic supplies forgotten in our haste to get away. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, branches snapping as the creature gave chase. The trail that had seemed so pleasant earlier now felt like an endless gauntlet. Roots seemed to reach up to trip us, branches whipped at our faces. The sound of our pursuer grew closer with each passing second. Sofia stumbled, and I scooped her up without breaking stride, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Miguel was crying, his little legs pumping as fast as they could, as Carlos half-carried, half-dragged him along. Just when I thought we couldn't run any farther, we burst out of the tree line into the parking lot. Carlos fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the van. We piled in, and he started the engine just as a massive shape emerged from the trail behind us. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of our pursuer. A tall, muscular figure covered in dark fur, with a face that was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. Its red eyes locked onto mine for a split second before Carlos floored the accelerator, sending gravel flying as we peeled out of the parking lot. We drove in tense silence, all of us too shaken to speak. It wasn't until we were back on the main road, the park far behind us, that Carlos finally spoke. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I looked back at the kids. They were pale and wide-eyed, but unharmed. "We're okay," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "We're safe now." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it, because now I knew what was out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest. Now I knew that the wilderness held secrets darker and stranger than I'd ever imagined. We never went back to Oakwood State Park after that day. We never told anyone the full story of what happened. Who would believe us? But our family picnics are strictly backyard affairs now, and the kids don't beg to go hiking anymore. Sometimes, when the wind rustles through the trees in our neighborhood, I'm transported back to that clearing. I can almost hear that unearthly growl, feel the prickle of those red eyes watching us, and I wonder, how many other families have stumbled into that clearing? How many others have come face to face with something that shouldn't exist? So if you're ever out in the woods and you find a perfect, secluded spot that seems too good to be true, maybe it is. Because sometimes the most beautiful places hide the darkest secrets, and sometimes we're not as alone in the wilderness as we'd like to think. Story 11. It wasn't until I found the second set of tracks, much larger and deeper than the boys', that I realized something was terribly wrong. I'd been searching for hours, calling his name through the thick trees, trying to keep the rising panic at bay. A lost kid in these woods was bad enough, but now I wasn't sure he was just lost. Something else was out here, and I didn't think it was human. I'd been a park ranger for years, and I thought I'd seen just about everything that could go wrong out here in the wilderness. People get lost, wander off the trails, sprain an ankle, sometimes even get caught in bad weather. But the woods, especially out here in the remote parts of the Appalachians, could play tricks on you. It was easy to get turned around, especially for kids. That's what I'd been telling myself when I got the call that afternoon. A kid from one of the camping groups had gone missing during a short hike. His name was Kevin, 10 years old, and he'd been with a group of other kids led by 2 camp counselors. They were doing one of the easy trails, a simple loop that should have only taken an hour. But at some point, Kevin had wandered off, and no one had seen him since. I got the call just after lunch, grabbed my gear, and set off immediately. Time was critical in these situations. The longer a kid was missing, the harder it became to find them. But I wasn't too worried at first. The trail he'd gone missing on was pretty straightforward, and most kids don't go far once they realize they're lost. The sun was still high when I reached the spot where Kevin had last been seen. A quiet section of the forest with towering oaks and thick patches of ferns. The counselors were there, frantic, but I managed to calm them down enough to get a clear story. Kevin had been lagging behind the group, complaining about being tired, but no one had noticed when exactly he'd slipped away. I started on the trail, following his small footprints in the soft dirt. They were easy enough to track at first. He'd veered off the path to the right, like he'd been curious about something in the woods, typical for a kid. Maybe he'd seen a deer or a rabbit, something that had caught his attention. As I followed his trail deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, the canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. It was cooler here, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and moss. I kept calling his name every few minutes, listening for any sign of movement, but all I got in return was the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind. After about an hour, I started to get this uneasy feeling. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the woods felt different. There was a stillness that hadn't been there before, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I stopped and listened, expecting to hear the usual sounds of birds or squirrels, but there was nothing, just silence. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. The footprints had stopped. Kevin's tracks had been steady up until this point, moving in a straight line through the underbrush, but now they just ended, like he'd vanished into thin air. I crouched down, studying the ground, trying to figure out what had happened. There were no signs of a struggle, no disturbed leaves or broken branches, just his small footprints, and then nothing. A chill crept up my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe he'd backtracked, or maybe the ground had gotten too hard for his prints to show. It wasn't unusual to lose a trail temporarily, especially in rocky areas. But then I saw the second set of tracks. These weren't Kevin's, they were much larger, and the spacing between them suggested someone much heavier had been walking through here. The prints were deep, the edges sharp, and they followed the same path Kevin had taken. Whoever, or whatever it was, had come through after him. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Bears were a possibility in these woods, though it wasn't common for them to follow someone like this. And these didn't look like bear tracks. They were more human-like, but larger, wider, almost like they'd been made by something walking on 2 legs. I stood up, scanning the trees around me, suddenly feeling very exposed. My hand instinctively went to the radio on my belt, but I hesitated. What was I going to say? That I found a second set of footprints and had a bad feeling? That wouldn't help anyone. I needed more information. I kept moving, but my pace was quicker now, more urgent. I followed the larger tracks, hoping that they'd lead me to Kevin. My heart was pounding in my chest, a mix of fear and frustration boiling inside me. The trail took me deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, the air cooler. Every few minutes I'd stop and call out Kevin's name, my voice echoing through the trees. But there was no response, no sound of movement, just that eerie, suffocating silence. And then, up ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. About 50 feet in front of me, in the middle of a small clearing, was a pile of rocks. They weren't natural. They'd been stacked deliberately, forming a crude, almost ritualistic shape, and at the base of the pile, half hidden in the dirt, was Kevin's backpack. I rushed forward, my heart in my throat. The backpack was torn, the fabric frayed as if it had been dragged through the underbrush. But there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, just the backpack, abandoned at the foot of this strange pile of rocks. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I inspected the area. The larger tracks were here too, circling the clearing, as if whatever had made them had been watching, waiting. "Kevin!" I shouted, louder this time, my voice raw. "Kevin, where are you?" Silence. Panic surged through me, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone taken him? Was there some kind of predator out here, stalking us both? I had no idea, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving, had to find him before it was too late. I grabbed the backpack and slung it over my shoulder, my eyes darting to the tree line. The larger tracks led away from the clearing, deeper into the forest. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling me to turn back, to call for help. But I couldn't leave him out here, not alone. I followed the tracks. The woods felt different now. The air was heavy, oppressive, and every shadow seemed to move in the corner of my eye. I kept my hand on the radio, ready to call for backup if things got worse. But something inside me told me that help wouldn't arrive in time. The tracks led me to a narrow ravine, the sides steep and covered in thick vegetation. I stopped at the edge, my eyes scanning the bottom of the ravine for any sign of Kevin. That's when I saw him. He was lying at the base of the ravine, curled up, his small body barely visible through the thick underbrush. Relief flooded through me, and I scrambled down the slope, my boots sliding on the loose dirt. "Kevin!" I shouted, half running, half sliding toward him. "It's okay, I'm here." But as I got closer, something stopped me in my tracks. Kevin wasn't moving, and standing over him, its massive form half hidden by the shadows of the trees, was the thing that had been following us. It wasn't human. The creature was tall, easily over 7 feet, its body covered in matted fur, its face twisted into a grotesque, almost wolf-like snarl. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of pure animalistic fear wash over me. For a moment neither of us moved. The creature stood there, its chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths, its massive hands hovering just above Kevin's limp form. It was waiting for me to make a move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen in place. All I could do was stand there, staring at the thing that had taken Kevin. And then, without a sound, the creature turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving me alone in the ravine with the boy. I rushed forward, dropping to my knees beside Kevin. He was breathing, thank God, but he was unconscious, his skin pale and cold to the touch. I scooped him up, my heart pounding in my chest as I scrambled back up the ravine, my mind racing. We had to get out of here, now. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't gone, and I knew, deep down, it was still watching. Story 12. I always thought my camera was a shield, a barrier between me and the world I was documenting. But on that day in the Cascade Mountains, I learned that some things can't be kept at arm's length, no matter how tightly you hold on to your gear. My name is Karen Chen, and this is the story of the vlog that changed everything. As a nature and wildlife vlogger with a modest but growing following, I was always on the lookout for my next big adventure. When I heard whispers of strange sightings in a remote area of the Cascades, I knew I had my next video. Unusual animal activity, they said. Perfect for views, I thought. If only I'd known what unusual really meant. The journey started like any other. I packed my gear, camera, drone, camping equipment, and set out for the mountains. The drive was long and winding, taking me deeper into the wilderness than I'd ever been before. As the familiar world faded away in my rearview mirror, excitement bubbled in my chest. This was going to be epic content. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. The parking lot was empty, which struck me as odd for such a beautiful day, but I shrugged it off. Less people meant cleaner shots after all. "Hey guys, it's Karen," I chirped at my camera as I shouldered my backpack. "We're about to embark on a 3-day trek into one of the most remote areas of the Cascade Mountains. Rumor has it there's been some weird animal activity out here, so we're gonna check it out." The first day of hiking was uneventful but beautiful. I captured stunning footage of the landscape, towering pines, crystal-clear streams, and glimpses of wildlife. As the sun began to set, I set up camp in a small clearing, feeling satisfied with the day's work. It was during my second day of filming that things started to get strange. I was setting up a shot of a particularly picturesque waterfall when I noticed something odd in my viewfinder. There, just at the edge of the frame, was a blur of movement. Something large and dark, moving far too quickly for me to catch clearly. I lowered my camera, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shrugging it off as a trick of the light, I resumed filming. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I huddled in my tent reviewing the day's footage, I saw it again. In the background of one of my panoramic shots, barely visible behind a stand of trees, was a figure. Tall, bipedal, covered in what looked like dark fur. My heart raced as I zoomed in, trying to get a clearer look, but the image was too grainy, too distant. "This can't be real," I muttered to myself, but a thrill of excitement ran through me. If this was what I thought it was, my subscriber count was about to go through the roof. The next morning, I set out with renewed determination. I was going to catch this thing on camera, whatever it was. I hiked deeper into the wilderness, my senses on high alert for any sign of my elusive subject. It was late afternoon when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air around me. I swung my camera around, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. There, not 20 yards away, stood a creature that defied explanation. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. But it was the face that made my blood run cold, a bizarre mix of ape and canine features with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the creature and I. Then, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something its size, it was gone, vanishing into the underbrush with barely a sound. I stood there, shaking, my camera still raised. Had I gotten it? Had I captured proof of something that would rock the scientific world to its core? With trembling hands, I rewound the footage, only to find nothing. Just trees and empty forest where the creature had stood. It was as if my camera had refused to see what my eyes had witnessed. Frustrated but undeterred, I pressed on, determined to get my proof. As the sun began to set, I found myself in a small meadow, the perfect spot to set up camp for the night. I was just pitching my tent when I heard it again, that bone-chilling growl closer this time. I spun around, camera at the ready, and there it was. The creature stood at the edge of the meadow, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. This time, I was ready. I hit record, my hands steady despite the fear coursing through me. For several breathless seconds, the creature just stood there watching me. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. I zoomed in, hardly daring to breathe. This was it. This was going to change everything. Suddenly the creature's head snapped towards me, its eyes locking onto my camera. A low, rumbling growl emanated from its throat, and before I could react, it charged. I dropped the camera and ran, terror lending speed to my legs. I could hear it behind me, branches snapping under its weight as it gave chase. I burst through the trees, my lungs burning, my heart feeling like it might explode from my chest. I don't know how long I ran, or how I managed to lose it. All I remember is collapsing against a large oak tree, gasping for air, straining my ears for any sign of pursuit. But the forest had gone eerily quiet. As the adrenaline began to fade, I realized with a sinking heart that I'd left all my gear behind, my camera, my tent, everything. But I was alive, and that was what mattered. I spent a miserable night huddled in the hollow of that oak tree, jumping at every sound, certain that at any moment the creature would find me. When dawn finally broke, I oriented myself as best I could and began the long trek back to civilization. It was late afternoon when I finally stumbled out of the forest and onto the road where I'd parked my car. I was dirty, exhausted, and empty-handed, but grateful to be alive. As I drove back to the city, my mind raced. What had I seen out there? What was that creature? And why hadn't my camera been able to capture it? I spent the next few weeks poring over every scrap of information I could find about cryptid sightings in the Cascades. Bigfoot, some called it. Sasquatch. But none of the descriptions quite matched what I'd seen. This was something different. Something that seemed to exist in a blind spot, visible to the naked eye, but invisible to technology. I debated whether to share my experience with my followers. In the end, I decided against it. Without proof, who would believe me? I'd be labeled a hoaxer, a fraud. My channel would be ruined. But I couldn't let it go. The memory of those intelligent eyes, that impossible speed, haunted me. I found myself jumping at shadows, startling at every unexplained noise. My once beloved forest hikes now filled me with dread. It's been months since that day in the mountains, and I haven't picked up my camera since. The thought of what might be lurking just beyond the frame, invisible to my lens but all too real, is more than I can bear. Sometimes late at night I hear a sound outside my window, a low rumbling growl that sends chills down my spine, and I wonder, did I really escape that day in the forest? Or did I just lead something back with me, something that's been watching and waiting all this time? So if you're out there, filming your own adventures, remember this. Not everything can be captured on camera. Some things exist in the spaces between pixels, in the shadows that your lens can't quite penetrate. And sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that refuse to be documented. As for me, I'm done with vlogging. Some stories are better left untold, some creatures better left undiscovered, because once you've seen what's really out there, you can never unsee it. And the camera? It's not the shield I thought it was. Sometimes it's nothing more than a target. Story 13. The first time I saw the tracks, I figured it was a bear. But when I realized they were following the kid's trail, an unsettling chill ran down my spine. Something big had been out here with him, something much larger than any bear. And now, alone in the deep forest with the sun setting fast, I wasn't so sure I wanted to find out what it was. It started like any other day at the park. A group of campers, a routine hike, and the usual warnings. Stick to the trail, stay together, don't wander off. But kids never listen, do they? The boy's name was Kevin, about 10 years old, and he'd been with a group of other kids on a short hike when he disappeared. 1 minute he was there, the next, gone. I got the call late in the afternoon. As a park ranger, I'd dealt with plenty of lost hikers over the years. Most of the time, it was nothing serious. People get turned around, maybe stray a bit off the path, but they always turn up eventually. This time, though, There was something different in the counselor's voice, something more urgent. He couldn't explain it, just that they had lost sight of Kevin, and despite their best efforts, they hadn't been able to find him. I grabbed my gear and set off toward the trail where the boy had last been seen. It wasn't far from the main campsite, a relatively easy loop through the forest, but the deeper I went, the quieter the woods became. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet either. The usual sounds, birds chirping, wind rustling through the trees, seemed to have vanished, leaving behind a kind of oppressive stillness that weighed on my chest. By the time I reached the point where the group had last seen Kevin, I was already on edge. The counselors were frantic, pacing up and down the trail, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my focus. He couldn't have gone far. A kid his age wouldn't stray too far off the trail, especially not alone. I crouched down, scanning the ground for any sign of him, and that's when I saw the small footprints veering off into the trees. They were faint, but clear enough to follow. "I found his tracks," I called over to the counselors. "I'm going after him. You stay here in case he doubles back." They nodded, their faces pale and anxious, but they didn't argue. I set off into the woods, my eyes locked on the small indentations in the dirt. Kevin's prints were erratic, zigzagging through the underbrush, as if he'd been wandering aimlessly. I followed them for about a quarter of a mile, calling his name every few minutes, but there was no response. The forest around me remained unnervingly silent. That's when I saw them. Another set of prints, much larger and deeper than Kevin's, had appeared next to his. At first I thought maybe it was an animal. Bears weren't unheard of in this area, and it wasn't unusual to see their tracks from time to time. But these prints, they weren't shaped like bear tracks. They were wider, longer, and there was something almost human about them. Only, no human should have feet that big. I stopped, staring at the prints for a long moment. Something about them made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I knelt down for a closer look, tracing the outline of one of the tracks with my finger. The edges were sharp, like whatever had made them had been moving quickly, its weight sinking deep into the soft earth. And the stride, it was enormous, far longer than a person could manage. A cold wave of dread washed over me. This was wrong, all of it. I stood up, scanning the dense trees around me, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the same suffocating stillness, the same heavy silence. I kept moving, but my pace quickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. The tracks, both Kevin's and the larger ones, led deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. Another half hour passed, and the trees around me grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. The air felt colder too, though the sun was still up. I called out Kevin's name again, my voice echoing through the trees, but the only response was the distant rustle of leaves. Then, up ahead, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Kevin's backpack, half buried in the dirt, lying at the base of a tree. I rushed over to it, my pulse racing. The backpack was torn, the fabric frayed like it had been dragged through the underbrush. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I picked it up. There were no signs of blood, no indication that Kevin had been hurt, but the sight of the abandoned backpack made my stomach churn. He'd been here, not long ago, but now... I stood up, scanning the area, trying to make sense of it all. The tracks continued past the backpack, leading further into the forest, but something had changed. The larger prints, the ones that had been following Kevin, they were deeper now, more deliberate. As if whatever had made them had picked up its pace. My breath quickened, and a knot formed in my throat. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. Whatever had been following Kevin wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. It was something else, something that shouldn't be out here. I hesitated, staring down the path where the tracks led. Part of me wanted to turn back, to call for help, to bring in backup. but there wasn't time. Kevin was out here somewhere, and I had to find him before whatever was following him did. I pressed on, my steps faster now, my senses heightened. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The tracks led me to a narrow ravine, and as I peered over the edge, I saw him, Kevin, lying motionless at the bottom of the ravine, his small body curled up against the base of a tree. "Kevin!" I shouted, scrambling down the slope, my boots slipping on the loose dirt. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached him, dropping to my knees beside him. He was breathing, thank God, but he was unconscious, his face pale and cold to the touch. I gently shook his shoulder, calling his name, but he didn't stir. I glanced around, my pulse racing, half expecting to see whatever had been following him emerge from the trees. But there was nothing. The forest was still, the oppressive silence hanging heavy in the air. I needed to get him out of here, now. I scooped Kevin up into my arms, his small body limp and cold, and began the slow, difficult climb back up the ravine. My legs burned, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every instinct was screaming at me to move faster, to get away from this place before whatever had left those tracks returned. By the time I reached the top, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest felt darker, more oppressive, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me from the shadows. I didn't stop moving. I couldn't. As I made my way back through the trees, Kevin still cradled in my arms, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing, whatever it was, following us. But the woods remained silent, the only sound my own labored breathing and the rustle of leaves beneath my feet. When I finally reached the trailhead, I could see the flashlights of the other rangers in the distance, their voices calling out as they searched for Kevin. Relief flooded through me, but it was tinged with a lingering sense of dread. I handed Kevin off to the paramedics, watching as they loaded him into the back of an ambulance. He was going to be okay, they said, just a little hypothermic, but he'd wake up soon enough. But as I stood there, watching the ambulance drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back, something that was still out there, watching, waiting. And deep down, I knew that whatever had left those tracks wasn't done yet. Story 14. I've spent my entire career searching for evidence of the Earth's past, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that remote cave. My name is Dr. David Mercer, and this is the story of how I came face to face with something that should have been long extinct. As a geologist specializing in paleoclimatology, I've explored some of the most isolated and inhospitable places on Earth. Caves have always been my favorite research sites, natural time capsules, preserving the secrets of our planet's history. But the Blackwater Cavern system in the Appalachian Mountains was different from the start. It began with a call from a colleague at the U.S. Geological Survey. They'd detected some unusual seismic activity in a previously unexplored section of the caverns and wanted me to investigate. The possibility of new geological formations had me packing my gear before the call even ended. The journey to the cave entrance was arduous, a grueling hike through dense forest and over rugged terrain. By the time I reached the small opening in the mountainside, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I set up a small base camp just outside the entrance, my tent a lonely spot of color against the dark rock face. As night fell, I found myself staring into the yawning blackness of the cave mouth, an inexplicable sense of unease settling over me. I'd explored hundreds of caves in my career, but something about this one felt different. Sleep came fitfully that night, my dreams filled with strange echoes and shadowy figures just beyond my sight. I awoke at dawn, eager to begin my expedition and shake off the lingering unease from the night before. As I geared up, helmet, headlamp, sample collection kit, I ran through my mental checklist. This was routine, just another day in the field. But as I stepped into the cool darkness of the cave, that feeling of wrongness returned, stronger than ever. The first few hours were uneventful. I made my way deeper into the cavern, taking samples and notes, marveling at the intricate formations that time and water had carved from the rock. But as I ventured further from the entrance, I began to notice something odd. The walls of the cave were marked with strange gouges, too uniform to be natural and too large to have been made by any known cave-dwelling creature. I ran my hand over one of the marks, a chill running down my spine as I felt the depth of the grooves. Whatever had made these was big and equipped with claws that could tear through solid rock. Probably just an artifact of the cave's formation, I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But even as I said it, I knew I was grasping at straws. I pressed on, the beam of my headlamp cutting through the darkness ahead. The passage began to narrow, forcing me to squeeze through tight gaps between towering rock formations. It was in one of these narrow corridors that I found the first bone. At first I thought it was just another odd rock formation, but as I knelt to examine it, my breath caught in my throat. It was unmistakably a bone, a femur to be precise, but far larger than any animal I knew of that could survive in a cave system. With shaking hands, I packed the bone into my sample bag. This was big, potentially career-defining, but as I straightened up I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, rumbling growl echoing through the cavern. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give away my position. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the scrape of something heavy moving across rock. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but years of fieldwork had taught me that sudden movements were often more dangerous than staying still. So I stood there, barely breathing, as the sounds grew closer. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting the beam of my headlamp set high off the ground in the darkness ahead. They blinked, and I caught a glimpse of a face that defied explanation. A mix of features that reminded me of ancient cave bears, but with an intelligence in its gaze that was almost human. For a moment we just stared at each other, this impossible creature and I. Then it let out another growl, the sound reverberating through the cavern and shaking loose small stones from the ceiling. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran, my pack bouncing painfully against my back as I scrambled through the narrow passages. I could hear it behind me, its bulk scraping against the cave walls as it gave chase. I burst out of the narrow corridor into a larger chamber, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. The creature was right behind me, its hot breath on the back of my neck. In desperation, I dove behind a large stalagmite, pressing myself against the cold, damp rock. The creature paused, sniffing the air. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, ready to run again if I had to. But after what felt like an eternity, I heard it move away, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. I waited until I could no longer hear any sound before I dared to move. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate my GPS unit, but I managed to plot a course back to the cave entrance. The journey out of the cave was a blur of fear and adrenaline. Every shadow seemed to hide a monstrous form. Every echo sounded like that bone-chilling growl. When I finally stumbled out into the sunlight, I collapsed on the ground, gulping in the fresh air. As my panic subsided, I realized I still had the bone sample in my pack, proof of what I'd encountered. But as I reached for my bag, a new fear gripped me. What would happen if I revealed what I'd found? Would it lead to an expedition that disturbed or even destroyed this creature's habitat? Or worse, would it result in the creature being hunted down in the name of science? In that moment, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I took the bone and buried it deep in the forest, marking the spot with a cairn that only I would recognize. Then I packed up my camp and hiked back to civilization, the weight of my secret heavier than any backpack I'd ever carried. I never told anyone the full story of what happened in Blackwater Cavern. My report to the USGS mentioned unusual formations and the need for further study, but nothing about what I'd seen or the bone I'd found. I couldn't bring myself to return to the cave, and eventually other projects took precedence. But I never forgot. On sleepless nights, I find myself poring over maps of the Appalachians, tracing the possible extent of that cave system. I wonder if there are more of those creatures down there, living remnants of a time long past. And I wonder if I did the right thing by keeping their existence a secret. Sometimes, when I'm giving lectures or leading student expeditions, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a pair of intelligent eyes watching me from the shadows. The rational part of my mind tells me it's impossible, that what I saw must have been a hallucination brought on by the cave's low oxygen levels and my own exhaustion. But then I remember the feel of those claw marks under my fingers, the unmistakable shape of that enormous bone, and I know that there are things in this world that science has yet to explain, creatures that defy our understanding of natural history. So if you're ever hiking in the Appalachians and you come across a cave entrance that fills you with an inexplicable sense of dread, remember my story. Because sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we choose to leave buried, and the greatest mysteries are the ones we dare not solve. As for me, I'll keep my secret and hope that whatever dwells in the depths of Blackwater Cavern remains undisturbed, because some things are better left in the dark, echoing through caverns that have never known the touch of sunlight. Story 15. The forest has a way of playing tricks on you, especially at night. But what I saw that evening wasn't a trick. It was a nightmare come to life. My name is Sarah, and I've been a park ranger for just over 6 months. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonless night in October. It started with a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I was doing my usual evening rounds, checking on the campsites and making sure no hikers were lost or in trouble. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I loved these quiet moments, just me and the wilderness. But that night, the quiet was shattered by that sound. At first, I thought it might be a bear. We'd had a few sightings in the area, nothing unusual for this time of year. I reached for my radio, ready to call it in, when I realized the sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural, almost human, but not quite. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The trees cast long shadows, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I swept the light back and forth, searching for the source of the sound. That's when I saw them, the tracks. My breath caught in my throat. These weren't bear tracks or any animal tracks I recognized. They were huge, easily twice the size of a man's foot, with clear impressions of toes and what looked like claws. I knelt down, my hand hovering over the print. It was fresh, the edges still crisp in the soft soil. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever made these tracks was big, really big. And it was close. I reached for my radio again, but all I got was static. Great, just great. I was alone out here with no way to call for backup. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement between the trees. Something tall, much taller than a person, and covered in what looked like dark fur. It was just for a second, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I froze, my flashlight beam fixed on the spot where I'd seen the figure. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Ranger Sarah. Is anyone there?" Silence. Not even the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. It was as if every creature was holding its breath, waiting. I took a step back, then another. My training told me to stay calm, to assess the situation rationally. but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I compromised, walking backward slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. That's when I heard it again, that low, rumbling growl. Closer this time, much closer, and now I could smell it too, a musky animal scent that seemed to fill the air around me. I turned and ran. I'm not proud of it, but in that moment, all my training went out the window. I just knew I had to get back to the ranger station, back to safety. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted through the trees, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, heavy footfalls and the crack of breaking branches. Whatever it was fast, much faster than me. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. The ranger station came into view, a welcome sight in the darkness. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. Just as I heard another growl, impossibly close now, I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, breathing hard, my heart pounding in my ears. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then a scratching sound at the door, not frantic or aggressive, but slow, deliberate, as if whatever was out there knew it had all the time in the world. I backed away from the door, reaching for the landline phone. It was dead. Of course it was. I was trapped, cut off from any help, with something I couldn't even begin to understand just outside. The scratching stopped, replaced by heavy breathing. I could see a shadow through the window, massive and hunched. It moved slowly, circling the station. I followed its movement, trying to keep as quiet as possible. Suddenly, it appeared at the window, a face that will haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was vaguely canine, with a long snout and pointed ears, but there was an intelligence in its eyes that no animal should possess. For a moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. Then it let out a howl that shook the very walls of the station. I scrambled back, knocking over a chair in my haste. The creature's eyes followed me, and I swear I saw its lips curl into something like a smile. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the darkness of the forest. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the station, a can of bear spray clutched in my trembling hands. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally gathered the courage to look outside. There, in the soft earth around the station, were more of those massive footprints. They circled the building several times before heading back into the forest. I followed them to the tree line, where they simply vanished, as if whatever had made them had simply disappeared into thin air. I reported the incident, of course, but without any concrete evidence beyond the footprints, which could have been explained away as a bear walking on its hind legs, and with my radio and the phone conveniently malfunctioning, there wasn't much to go on. My superiors listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They chalked it up to the stress of the job and the trick shadows can play on a tired mind. But I know what I saw that night. I know it was real. And I know it's still out there, somewhere in the depths of the forest, waiting. Every time I go on patrol now, especially as night falls, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That somewhere, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, something is lurking in the shadows, biding its time. I've heard the stories, of course, tales of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or whatever you want to call it. I used to laugh them off as campfire stories meant to scare tourists. Now, I'm not so sure. There's a whole world out there that we don't understand, hidden just beyond the veil of what we consider normal. Since that night, I've done my research. I've read accounts from all over the country, hikers, campers, even other rangers who've had similar encounters. The details vary, but the core of the story is always the same. Something big, something that shouldn't exist, seen fleetingly in the wilderness. I've learned to be more prepared now. I always carry a backup radio and a portable charger for my phone. I've become an expert in tracking, studying every print and broken twig I come across, and I've started keeping a journal, documenting everything I see and hear that seems out of the ordinary. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that howl again, echoing across the valley. It sends a shiver down my spine every time, but it also fills me with a strange sense of excitement. Because now I know the truth. There are mysteries out there, waiting to be uncovered, and I intend to find answers. I'm not the same naive ranger I was 6 months ago. The forest has taught me that there's more to this world than what we can easily explain. It's taught me to be vigilant, to trust my instincts, and to never, ever take the wilderness for granted. So if you're ever out in the woods and you hear a sound you can't quite place, or see a shadow that seems just a little too large to be natural, remember my story. Remember that there are things out there that defy explanation. And whatever you do, don't run, because out there in the wild, you're not the top of the food chain anymore. As for me, I'll keep patrolling these woods, flashlight in hand, always alert, always watching, because someone needs to stand guard at the edge of the known world, ready to face whatever might emerge from the shadows. And who knows, maybe one day I'll come face to face with that creature again, and this time I'll be ready. Story 16. I always thought I was prepared for anything the wilderness could throw at me. Years of solo camping had given me confidence, maybe too much, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the Adirondacks, when the line between predator and prey became terrifyingly blurred. My name is Amber Reeves, and this is the story of the longest night of my life. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. I'd chosen a remote spot in the Adirondack Mountains, far from the popular campsites and well-worn trails. The kind of place where you could truly feel alone in the wilderness. The hike in was challenging, but exhilarating. By late afternoon, I'd found the perfect clearing to set up camp, a small, flat area near a babbling brook, surrounded by towering pines. As I pitched my tent and gathered firewood, I felt the stress of city life melting away. As night fell, I sat by my small campfire, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest. The stars were coming out, brighter than I'd ever seen them in the city. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first hint that something was off came just as I was about to turn in for the night. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond my firelight, louder and closer than any normal forest creature would venture. I paused, my hand on the tent zipper, and listened intently. For a long moment, there was nothing but the usual nighttime forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I was about to shrug it off when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. My heart began to race. Bears were common in this area, but something about that sound didn't fit. It was deeper, more guttural than any bear I'd ever heard, and there was something else in it, something almost human. I quickly zipped myself into my tent, my mind racing. What could make a sound like that? I ran through my mental catalogue of local wildlife, but nothing fit. As I lay there in the darkness, straining my ears for any further sounds, a new noise froze the blood in my veins. Heavy, rhythmic breathing just outside my tent. I held my breath, hardly daring to move. The breathing got closer, and I could hear the rustle of fur against the tent fabric. Whatever was out there, it was big, much bigger than a bear. Suddenly a shadow fell across the tent, something huge, blocking out what little moonlight had been filtering through. I could see its silhouette through the thin nylon, a shape that defied explanation. It stood on 2 legs, but its proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms were too long, its shoulders too broad, and its head. I couldn't make out details, but it wasn't shaped like any animal I knew. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the creature circled my tent. Each breath it took sounded like a windstorm, and I could smell its musky animal odor even through the tent fabric. My mind raced through my options. I had bear spray in my pack, but would it work on whatever this was? And could I even reach it without alerting the creature? As if sensing my thoughts, the creature let out another of those bone-chilling growls. It was so close now, I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain that at any moment claws would tear through the thin barrier of my tent. But the attack never came. Instead, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard the creature move away. Its heavy footsteps receded into the forest, accompanied by the snap of branches under its weight. I lay there, barely breathing, listening intently for any sign of its return. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if every creature was holding its breath along with me. As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion took over, and despite my terror, I found myself drifting into a fitful sleep. I awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented. The inside of my tent was dimly lit. Dawn must be approaching. For a blissful moment I thought perhaps the events of the night had been a particularly vivid nightmare. Then I heard it again, that deep, rumbling growl, closer than ever. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it must be audible. Through the tent wall, I could see a massive shape moving just beyond the trees at the edge of my campsite. It was still there. It had been out there all night, watching, waiting. As the sky began to lighten, I caught glimpses of the creature through the trees. Its fur was dark, matted in places, and its movements were unnervingly fluid for something of its size. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, intelligent, almost human-like in their expression, and fixed unwaveringly on my tent. I knew I couldn't stay there. Sooner or later I'd have to make a run for it. But the creature was between me and the trail back to civilization. I was trapped. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the trees, the creature became more agitated. It paced back and forth at the edge of the clearing, occasionally letting out one of those soul-shaking growls. Was it getting hungry? Angry? I had no way to interpret its behavior, and that uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the creature itself. I used the creature's pacing to my advantage, quietly packing up my essential gear. If I was going to run, I needed to be ready. I left the tent pitched. It might buy me a few crucial seconds if the creature couldn't immediately see where I was. Hours passed like this, me silently preparing while keeping a wary eye on the pacing creature. By midday, I was drenched in sweat, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. That's when I saw my opportunity. The creature had wandered a bit further into the woods, partially obscured by a thick stand of pines. It was now or never. Taking a deep breath, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and slipped out. I made it about 10 steps before I heard it, a roar of rage that shook the leaves on the trees. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, my pack bouncing painfully against my back, branches whipping at my face as I tore through the underbrush. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the forest with terrifying speed. The trail seemed endless, each bend revealing only more trees, more obstacles between me and safety. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror drove me onward. Just when I thought I couldn't run another step, I burst out of the tree line onto the gravel road where I'd parked my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. As I finally managed to unlock the door, I heard one final roar from the forest edge. There it stood, half hidden by the trees, its massive form heaving with exertion. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw something in its gaze that chilled me to my core, not just hunger or rage, but a cold, calculating intelligence. I threw myself into the car and peeled out, gravel spraying as I accelerated down the road. In my rearview mirror, I saw the creature melt back into the forest, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. The drive home was a blur of adrenaline and lingering fear. I kept expecting to see a hulking shape burst out of the woods at every turn. It wasn't until I was back in my apartment, doors locked and blinds drawn, that I finally allowed myself to break down. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? I had no proof, No evidence of what I'd encountered, just the lingering nightmares and a newfound fear of the dark. I've done my research since then, poring over cryptozoology websites and local legends. Some call it Bigfoot, others Sasquatch or Wendigo, but none of the descriptions quite match what I saw. This was something different, something that seemed to exist in the liminal space between myth and reality. I haven't been camping since that day. The thought of being out in the wilderness, vulnerable and exposed, sends me into a panic. Sometimes, when the wind howls outside my window at night, I'm transported back to that tent, feeling the hot breath of something impossible just inches away. So if you're planning a solo camping trip in a remote area, remember my story. Remember that there are things out there that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our world. And sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we don't believe in until it's too late. As for me, I'll stick to the safety of the city, where the only monsters are the ones we create ourselves. Because I know now that in the deep woods, in the places where civilization is just a distant memory, there are things that wait in the darkness, things that watch and hunger and remember. And they're always listening for the sound of a lonely camper, zipping themselves into a flimsy nylon tent, believing they're safe in their solitude. Story 17. I used to think the scariest thing in these mountains was the possibility of encountering a grizzly bear. Now I'd give anything for it to have just been a bear. My name's Mike, and my wife Lisa and I have been avid campers for years. We thought we'd seen it all, storms, wildlife, you name it. But nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered in the Cascade Mountains last fall. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just the two of us in the wilderness. We'd heard rumors about Sasquatch sightings in the area, but we laughed them off. To us, they were just local legends, stories to attract tourists and sell tacky souvenirs in gift shops. We set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and the sound of a nearby stream. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our campsite, we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and planning our hike for the next day. That's when we heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was just the snapping of twigs, easily dismissed as a deer or some other small animal. But then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to circle our camp just beyond the reach of our firelight. Lisa gripped my arm, her eyes wide. "Mike," she whispered, "what is that?" I stood up slowly, grabbing the flashlight from our gear. "Probably just a curious bear," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'll check it out." I swept the beam of the flashlight across the tree line, the shadows seeming to dance and shift in its light. For a moment I thought I saw something, a flash of movement too quick to focus on. Then, silence. The footsteps had stopped. We spent a restless night in our tent, every rustle of leaves and gust of wind setting our nerves on edge. When morning finally came, we were exhausted but relieved. In the light of day, our fears seemed silly, products of an overactive imagination and too many campfire stories. That is, until we stepped outside. Our campsite was a mess. The cooler we'd secured in a tree to keep away from bears had been torn down, its contents strewn across the ground. Our backpacks, which we'd left under the tarp, were several feet from where we'd left them, covered in dirt as if they'd been rifled through. But it was the footprints that made my blood run cold. They circled our entire campsite, massive impressions in the soft earth that dwarfed my own boot prints. Whatever had made them walked on two legs, but they were far too large to be human. Lisa's face had gone pale. "Mike," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to leave, now." I couldn't argue. We packed up as quickly as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders, the feeling of being watched prickling at the back of my neck. As we started down the trail, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being followed. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap, or leaves rustle, always just out of sight. Lisa heard it too. I could see it in the way she kept glancing back, her grip tightening on her walking stick. About an hour into our hike, we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. There, in a small clearing, was a structure made of broken branches and logs, far too intricate to have been created by wind or falling trees. It was almost like a shelter, but cruder, more instinctual. "Mike," Lisa's voice quavered, did someone make that?" Before I could answer, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the trees. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite human. It was something in between, something that made every hair on my body stand on end. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We ran like we'd never run before, our packs bouncing against our backs, branches whipping at our faces. The sound of pursuit was unmistakable now. Heavy footfalls crashing through the underbrush behind us. We burst out onto the logging road where we'd parked our car, fumbling with the keys in panic. Just as I wrenched the driver's side door open, I looked back. There, at the edge of the trees, stood something I still struggle to describe. It was tall, impossibly tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a mix of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that reflected an unsettling intelligence. For a moment our gazes locked, and I felt a chill that went beyond mere fear. This wasn't just an animal. Whatever this creature was, it was thinking, reasoning. We peeled out of there, gravel spraying from our tires. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure step out onto the road, watching us go. It made no attempt to chase us further, almost as if it was content to let us leave its territory. The drive home was silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. It wasn't until we were safely back in our apartment, doors locked and curtains drawn, that we finally spoke about it. "What do we do now?" Lisa asked, her hands shaking as she clutched a mug of tea. I didn't have an answer. Who would believe us? We had no proof, no photos, nothing but our own rattled testimony. And part of me, the part that still clung to a rational, orderly view of the world, wanted to dismiss it all as an elaborate hoax or a bear standing on its hind legs. But I knew what I'd seen. Those eyes, that deliberate gaze, it haunts me still. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research. I pored over every Bigfoot sighting, every scrap of alleged evidence. Most of it was clearly fake, the product of hoaxers or over-enthusiastic believers. But some rang true, especially the accounts from the Pacific Northwest, where we'd had our encounter. I found myself on forums, in chat rooms, talking to others who claimed to have had similar experiences. Many of their stories aligned with ours, the footprints, the structures in the woods, the feeling of being watched. It was both comforting and terrifying to know we weren't alone. Lisa was less enthusiastic about my newfound obsession. "Mike," she'd say, "maybe we should just try to forget about it. Move on." But I couldn't. The encounter had shaken my understanding of the world to its core. If this creature existed, what else might be out there, hidden just beyond the edges of civilization? It was about a month after our trip when the package arrived. No return address, just our names scrawled in messy handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small cloth bag. The note was brief. "You're not crazy. Be careful who you tell. They're watching." In the bag was a clump of coarse, dark hair. I had it tested, of course. The results came back inconclusive, not matching any known animal, but not definitively proving anything either. Just another piece of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each passing day. Lisa and I have been back to the mountains since then. Not to the same spot. I don't think either of us is ready for that yet. But to other trails, other campsites. We're more cautious now, more aware of our surroundings. Every snapped twig, every shadow at dusk sends a jolt of adrenaline through my system. But there's something else too, something I'm almost ashamed to admit. A part of me hopes to see it again, to confirm that I'm not crazy, that what we experienced was real. It's a dangerous curiosity, I know. These aren't creatures to be trifled with if the stories are to be believed. We've had a few more strange experiences since that first encounter. Nothing as dramatic, but enough to keep us convinced. A set of tracks here, an oddly broken tree there. Once, while camping near Mount Rainier, we woke to find our campsite surrounded by a ring of twisted branches. A warning or a boundary marker, I'm still not sure. I've started keeping a journal of our experiences and those of others I've connected with online. Someday, I hope to piece it all together into something coherent, something that might shed light on these elusive creatures. But for now, we keep our stories mostly to ourselves. The world isn't ready for the truth, not yet, and maybe that's for the best. There's a delicate balance out there in the wilderness, one that's persisted for who knows how long. So if you find yourself in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest and you feel that prickling sensation of being watched, remember our story. Remember that there are things out there that defy explanation, creatures that blur the line between myth and reality. And if you hear heavy footsteps circling your camp at night, do what we didn't. Pack up and leave. Because out there, in the shadow of the mountains, we're not at the top of the food chain anymore. We're just visitors in a world we barely understand, a world where legends come to life in the darkness between the trees. Story 18. I've been a hunter for 30 years, but nothing in those 3 decades prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of northern Michigan last fall. It was supposed to be a routine hunting trip. Instead, it became a fight for survival against something I still can't fully explain. My name's John, and I've tracked everything from white-tailed deer to black bear across the Midwest. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. Turns out, I didn't know a damn thing. It started on a crisp October morning. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the forest in shades of red and gold. I'd set out before dawn, my trusted rifle slung over my shoulder, ready for a day of tracking deer. The first few hours were uneventful. I spotted some promising tracks, noticed a few scrapes on trees where bucks had marked their territory, nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't until around midday that things started to get strange. I was moving through a particularly dense part of the forest when I noticed the first oddity, claw marks on a tree. Now, bear scratches aren't uncommon in these parts, but these were different. They were higher up the trunk than any bear could reach, and deeper, like whatever made them had fingers instead of paws. I ran my hand over the gouges in the bark, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Something about those marks felt wrong, unnatural. As I pressed deeper into the woods, following what I thought was a promising deer trail, I began to notice more strange signs. Branches broken at odd angles, too high for deer. More of those unsettling claw marks. And then there was the smell. It hit me all at once, a powerful musky odor that made my nose wrinkle. It wasn't the usual forest smells I was accustomed to. This was something primal, something that stirred a deep, instinctual fear in the pit of my stomach. I should have turned back then. Every instinct honed over decades in the wilderness was screaming at me to get out. But curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was causing these strange signs. The trail led me to a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me dead in my tracks. The ground was torn up, like something massive had been thrashing around. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a deer carcass. Now, I've seen plenty of kills in my time, wolf, bear, even the occasional mountain lion. But this was different. The deer hadn't just been killed, it had been torn apart. Limbs were scattered across the clearing, and the way the flesh was shredded spoke of a savagery I'd never encountered before. I knelt down to examine the carcass, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, rifle at the ready, scanning the tree line. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting the afternoon sun, set in a face that was both familiar and alien. It was like looking at a wolf, but wrong. The snout was too long, the body too large. It stood on its hind legs, easily 7 feet tall, with arms that ended in wickedly curved claws. For a moment, we just stared at each other, hunter and hunted, though I wasn't sure which was which anymore. Then it let out a howl that shook me to my core. It wasn't the cry of a wolf or any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost human, filled with a hunger and rage that sent ice through my veins. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 30 years of hunting experience went out the window in the face of something I couldn't comprehend. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I could hear it behind me, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something that size. Trees creaked and snapped as it barreled through them, that terrible howl echoing through the forest. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that mad dash through the woods. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find safety. Finally, mercifully, I broke through the tree line onto the old logging road where I'd parked my truck. I threw myself into the cab, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. As I peeled out onto the road, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror, a dark shape at the edge of the forest, watching me go. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, my heart still pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. That night, holed up in a cheap motel room with every light blazing, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a bear, maybe standing on its hind legs. But I knew that wasn't right. What I'd seen was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist outside of campfire stories and old legends. I spent the next few weeks in a daze, jumping at shadows and unable to sleep through the night. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? Hell, I barely believed it myself, but I couldn't let it go. The memory of those eyes, that howl, haunted me. I started researching, digging into old newspapers and local history, and what I found chilled me to the bone. There were stories going back decades of strange sightings in those woods, hunters disappearing without a trace, livestock found torn apart in ways that defied explanation, and whispered accounts of a creature that walked like a man but hunted like a wolf. The locals called it different names, Dogman, Wendigo, Skinwalker, but the descriptions were always the same, large, wolf-like, but with an unsettling human quality, exactly what I'd seen. I've been back to those woods since then, not to hunt, not anymore, but to watch, to try and understand. Each time I've found more signs, those distinctive claw marks, strange tracks that seem to appear and disappear at random, the lingering scent of something wild and dangerous. I've had a few more encounters, brief glimpses through the trees or a howl in the distance. Never as close as that first time, but enough to keep me convinced that what I saw was real. I've connected with others online who've had similar experiences. We share stories, compare notes. Most people think we're crazy, or that we've just seen bears or wolves and let our imaginations run wild. But we know the truth. There's something out there in the deep woods, something that defies easy explanation. It's not a bear, not a wolf, not anything science has a name for. It's something older, something that's managed to stay hidden on the fringes of our world. I still hunt, but differently now. I carry a camera as often as I carry a rifle. I'm more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. Every snapped twig, every shadow at dusk sends a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Some nights, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear that howl again, echoing across the valleys. It no longer fills me with just fear, but with a strange mix of dread and excitement. Because now I know the truth. The wilderness is wilder than we ever imagined. So if you find yourself in the deep woods and you feel that prickling sensation on the back of your neck like you're being watched, remember my story. Remember that there are things out there that we can't explain, creatures that exist in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. And if you hear a howl that doesn't sound quite right, that stirs something primal in your gut, do what I didn't. Get out. Because in those moments, you're not the hunter anymore. You're the prey. And whatever's out there, whatever's watching from just beyond the firelight, it's been playing this game a lot longer than we have. As for me, I'll keep going back, keep searching, because now that I know what's out there, I can't look at the world the same way. There are mysteries in those woods, secrets that have stayed hidden for centuries, and someday, somehow, I'm going to uncover the truth. But until then, I'll keep my rifle close, my senses sharp, and my mind open to the possibility that there's more to this world than we ever dreamed. Because out there, in the wild places where civilization fades away, the old legends aren't just stories, they're warnings. Story 19. I've always loved solo hiking, the serenity of being alone with nature, but after what happened on that mountain trail, I'm not sure I'll ever hike alone again. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some creatures, once encountered, hunt you long after you've left the wilderness behind. My name is Emily, and I'm an experienced hiker. I've tackled some of the toughest trails in the country, from the Appalachian Trail to the Pacific Crest, but nothing in my years of outdoor adventure could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of northern Minnesota last summer. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day trek through the Superior National Forest. I'd planned my route meticulously, packed all the necessary gear, and let my family know my itinerary. The first day went perfectly. The weather was ideal, cool and clear, with a light breeze keeping the mosquitoes at bay. As the sun began to set on the second day, I started looking for a good spot to make camp. That's when I saw it. An old cabin tucked away in a small clearing, barely visible through the dense foliage. It wasn't on any of my maps, which should have been my first warning sign. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached the cabin cautiously, noting the weathered wood and sagging roof. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, maybe decades. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, sending a shiver down my spine. The interior was sparse, a rusted iron stove in one corner, a dilapidated cot in another, but it was the walls that caught my attention. They were covered in crude drawings, etched directly into the wood with what looked like knife marks. At first glance, they seemed like typical wilderness scenes, trees, mountains, animals, but as I looked closer, I realized something was off. Among the familiar shapes were others, things I couldn't quite make sense of. Tall, emaciated figures with elongated limbs. Faces that were almost human, but not quite, with features that seemed to shift the longer I stared at them. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. There was something profoundly unsettling about those images, something that spoke to a part of my brain far older than rational thought. I should have left then. Should have set up my tent far away from that eerie cabin and its disturbing artwork. But the sun was setting fast, and the thought of sleeping outside with whatever had inspired those drawings potentially lurking in the darkness was even less appealing. I set up my sleeping bag on the old cot, trying to ignore the creaking of the cabin in the wind and the feeling that the eyes in those drawings were watching me. Sleep came fitfully, filled with strange dreams of running through endless forests, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel breathing down my neck. A howl jolted me awake. For a moment I was disoriented, forgetting where I was. Then it came again, a long, mournful cry that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote. It sounded almost human, but distorted, as if coming from a throat not meant for human sounds. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cabin walls. In the harsh light, the drawings seemed to move, the strange figures dancing in the shadows. Another howl, closer this time, much closer, and now I could hear something else, the snap of branches, the rustle of leaves. Something was out there, circling the cabin. I pressed my eye to a crack in the wooden walls, scanning the tree line. For a long moment, there was nothing but darkness. Then I saw it, a figure tall and impossibly thin, moving between the trees with an unnatural grace. It was hard to make out details in the gloom, but what I could see made my blood run cold. The creature was easily 7 feet tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin, where visible, was a sickly pale color that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for months to come. Gaunt, with sunken eyes that reflected the light like an animal's, and a mouth that seemed to be fixed in a perpetual hungry grin. I stumbled back from the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or some toxic plant I'd accidentally ingested. But the howl that split the night was all too real. So close now it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. I could hear scratching at the walls, as if the creature was trying to find a way in. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I grabbed my backpack, not bothering to pack up my sleeping bag or any of my other gear. All that mattered was getting out, getting away from whatever was out there. I burst out of the cabin door, my headlamp cutting a frantic path through the darkness. I ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, the heavy breathing, the crack of twigs under inhuman feet. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that mad dash through the forest. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to find my way back to civilization, back to safety. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally allowed myself to slow down. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead. I leaned against a tree, gasping for breath, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. Nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest waking up. Birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Had I imagined it all? Was it just a vivid nightmare brought on by spending the night in that creepy old cabin? But as I looked down at myself, clothes torn, arms scratched and bleeding from my frantic flight through the woods, I knew it had been real. Whatever I'd seen, whatever had chased me, it wasn't a figment of my imagination. I managed to find my way back to the trail and eventually to my car. The drive home was a blur, my mind still reeling from what I'd experienced. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every shadow, every unexpected sound. Sleep became a luxury, my nights haunted by dreams of that tall, pale figure and its hungry grin. I've done research since then, trying to make sense of what I saw. I found stories, legends from Native American tribes in the area about creatures they call Wendigos, once human beings transformed by greed and hunger into monstrous predators. The descriptions match what I saw all too closely for comfort. I've connected with others online who claim to have had similar encounters. Most people dismiss us as crazy or assume we just saw a bear or some other normal forest animal and let our imaginations run wild. But we know the truth. There's something out there in the deep woods, something that defies easy explanation. I still hike, still camp, but never alone, not anymore. And I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings. Every snapped twig, every shadow at dusk sends a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that howl again, echoing across the miles. It sends a shiver down my spine, but it also fills me with a strange sense of, not exactly excitement, but awareness. Because now I know that the world is bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than I ever imagined. So if you're ever hiking in the northern forests, and you come across an old cabin that's not on any map, remember my story. Remember that there are things out there that we can't explain, creatures that exist in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. And if you hear a howl that doesn't sound quite right, that stirs something primal in your gut, don't do what I did. Don't investigate, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because in those moments, you're not at the top of the food chain anymore. You're prey. And whatever's out there, whatever's watching from just beyond the firelight, it's been hunting a lot longer than we've been around to be hunted. As for me, I'll keep exploring, keep pushing the boundaries of the known world. But I'll do it with open eyes and a healthy respect for the mysteries that still lurk in the wild places of the earth. Because sometimes the legends aren't just stories. Sometimes they're warnings. And in the deep dark woods, it pays to heed those warnings, lest you become just another tale told around the campfire, another mysterious disappearance in the vast wilderness. Story 20. I've seen things in these woods that would make most people question their sanity. But what I encountered that night in Shadow Creek, it shook me to my core. It made me realize that sometimes the monsters in our campfire stories are more real than we'd like to believe. My name's Dave, and I've been a park ranger in the Cascade Mountains for over 2 decades. I thought I knew every creature, every sound, every secret these forests held. I was wrong. Dead wrong. It started with reports of unusually aggressive deer kills. Nothing too out of the ordinary at first. Nature can be brutal after all. But as the reports kept coming in, a pattern emerged that set my teeth on edge. The kills were too clean, too calculated. Whatever was doing this wasn't your average predator. I remember the day I decided to investigate like it was yesterday. The air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. Leaves crunched under my boots as I made my way deep into the heart of Shadow Creek, an area known for its dense forest and steep ravines. The first sign that something was off came about 2 miles in. I found a deer carcass, or what was left of it. Now I've seen plenty of kills in my time, wolf, bear, even the occasional mountain lion. But this was different. The deer hadn't just been killed, it had been torn apart with a savagery that made my stomach churn. I knelt down to examine the remains, my mind racing. The bite marks were all wrong. Too large for a wolf, but not consistent with a bear either. And there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. Mixed in with the deer's blood were strands of coarse, dark hair that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first glance, they looked canine, like a wolf but impossibly large. As I followed them, I realized with growing unease that they were bipedal. Whatever had made these tracks had been walking on 2 legs. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. It was HQ, asking for a status update. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. How could I explain what I was seeing without sounding like I'd lost my mind? I gave them a vague response about continuing my patrol and clicked off, my hand shaking slightly as I returned the radio to my belt. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, to areas rarely visited even by the most adventurous hikers. The trees grew denser, blocking out most of the fading daylight. An eerie silence had fallen over the woods, no birdsong, no rustling of small animals. It was as if every living creature was holding its breath, waiting. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before, not in all my years in these mountains. It was deep, primal, and it stirred something in my gut that went beyond fear. This was an ancient terror, the kind our ancestors must have felt when they huddled around fires, wary of the darkness beyond. I spun around, my hand instinctively going to my sidearm. The forest seemed to close in around me, shadows deepening despite the fact that sunset was still an hour away. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the gloom between the trees. Then I saw it. Just for a moment, a shape moved between 2 massive pines about 50 yards away. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a bulk that put the largest grizzly to shame. But it wasn't a bear. The way it moved was all wrong, too fluid, too deliberate. For a split second our eyes met. I say eyes, but what I saw were more like burning coals set in a face that was a nightmarish blend of wolf and man. The intelligence in that gaze froze me to the spot. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. There was thought behind those eyes, calculation, hunger. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows with a speed that defied its size. I stood there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but I couldn't move. I was a ranger, damn it. It was my job to protect these woods and the people who visited them. Slowly, I unholstered my gun. It felt pitifully inadequate against whatever I'd just seen, but its weight in my hand was reassuring nonetheless. I took a deep breath, trying to still my shaking hands, and began to move in the direction the creature had gone. The forest seemed to grow darker with each step, the shadows lengthening in impossible ways. I could hear movement all around me, the crack of branches, the rustle of leaves. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I'm not sure how long I wandered through that twilight nightmare. Time seemed to lose all meaning. But eventually, I found myself in a small clearing. And there, in the center, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a den of sorts, but like nothing I'd ever seen before. Bones were scattered everywhere, deer, elk, and, oh God, were those human remains. The ground was torn up, great furrows carved into the earth by claws larger than my hand. And the smell, it was a mixture of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else, something musky and alien that burned my nostrils. I knew I should leave, should radio for backup and get the hell out of there. But a morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know, had to understand what I was dealing with. That's when I heard the growl again, so close it seemed to vibrate through my bones. I spun around, gun raised, and found myself face to face with the stuff of nightmares. It stood on two legs, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. Muscles rippled beneath fur that seemed to absorb the light. Its snout was long, filled with teeth that would put a grizzly's to shame. But it was the eyes that held me, yellow, intelligent, and filled with a hunger that went beyond mere predatory instinct. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. I knew I should shoot, should do something, anything. But I was frozen, caught in the gaze of something that shouldn't exist outside of legend. Then it moved, faster than anything that size had a right to. I fired, the gun's report shattering the unnatural silence of the forest. I saw blood bloom on the creature's shoulder, but it didn't even slow down. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Training, duty, pride, all of it went out the window in the face of primal terror. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I could hear it behind me, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something that size. Trees creaked and snapped as it barreled through them, that terrible growl echoing through the forest. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. Luck, maybe, or some long-dormant survival instinct that guided my feet. I threw myself into the cab, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. As I peeled out onto the access road, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror, a dark shape at the edge of the forest, watching me go. I didn't slow down until I hit the main highway, my heart still pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. I reported what I'd seen, of course, but without any concrete evidence beyond my own rattled testimony. There wasn't much to go on. My superiors listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They chalked it up to stress, maybe an encounter with an unusually aggressive bear. But I know what I saw. I know it's still out there, somewhere in the depths of Shadow Creek, waiting. Every time I go on patrol now, especially as night falls, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That somewhere, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, Something is lurking in the shadows, biding its time. I've heard the stories, of course, tales of dogmen, werewolves, skinwalkers. I used to dismiss them as campfire tales meant to scare tourists. Now, I'm not so sure. There's a whole world out there that we don't understand, hidden just beyond the veil of what we consider normal. So if you're ever hiking in these mountains, and you hear a growl that doesn't sound quite right, or see a shadow move in a way that defies explanation, remember my story. Remember that there are things out there that we can't explain, creatures that exist in the twilight between myth and reality. And whatever you do, don't run. Because out there in the wild, you're not the top of the food chain anymore, and some predators enjoy the chase. Story 21. I used to think the scariest thing in nature was getting caught in a sudden storm. Now, I'd give anything to be back in the rain, lightning crashing around me, rather than trapped in this cave with whatever is in here with us. My name's Amy, and what was supposed to be a romantic hiking trip with my boyfriend Tom has turned into a nightmare I'm not sure we'll survive. It all started innocently enough, with a weather forecast that promised clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect for a weekend trek through the Appalachian Mountains. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. Tom and I had been dating for about a year, and while we both loved the outdoors, this was our first multi-day hike together. We packed our gear meticulously, double-checking our supplies and route. Everything seemed perfect. The first day and a half of our hike were everything we'd hoped for. The autumn colors were in full glory, painting the mountainsides in vibrant reds and golds. We saw deer, a family of raccoons, and even caught a glimpse of a black bear in the distance. As the sun began to set on our second day, we felt invigorated, alive in a way that only nature can make you feel. That's when things started to go wrong. The storm hit without warning. One minute we were walking along, admiring the sunset, and the next we were being pelted by rain so heavy it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. Thunder boomed overhead, and lightning lit up the sky in terrifying flashes. "We need to find shelter," Tom yelled over the howling wind. I nodded, too focused on not slipping on the suddenly treacherous trail to respond. We stumbled along, soaked to the bone and shivering, desperately searching for anywhere we could wait out the storm. That's when Tom spotted it, a dark opening in the mountainside, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. "There!" he shouted, pointing. "A cave!" Relief flooded through me as we made our way towards the entrance. It was a tight squeeze, but once inside, we found ourselves in a spacious cavern, blessedly dry and sheltered from the raging storm outside. Tom clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Looks like we lucked out," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "This place is huge." I nodded, shrugging off my sodden backpack. "Yeah, lucky us," I replied, but something in my tone must have given away my unease. Tom's grin faded slightly. "What's wrong?" I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. "Nothing, it's just... Doesn't this seem a little too convenient?" Tom laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, Amy, it's just a cave. We'll wait out the storm and be on our way in the morning." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But as I looked around the cavern, my flashlight beam joining his, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I saw them. The claw marks. They ran along the walls of the cave, deep gouges in the stone that no normal animal could have made. Some were low to the ground, others impossibly high up, and they were everywhere. "Tom," I whispered, my voice shaking, "look at the walls." He turned, his flashlight beam following mine. I saw his eyes widen as he took in the claw marks. "What the hell?" Before he could finish his thought, a smell hit us. A stench so foul it made my eyes water. It was like rotting meat mixed with something musky and alien, a scent that spoke of predator, of danger. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," Tom said, his earlier bravado evaporating. "We should try to find another shelter." But as we turned back towards the entrance, a sound froze us in our tracks. It was a low, rumbling growl coming from deep within the cave. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not a bear, not a mountain lion, not any animal I could name. It was deeper, more guttural, almost hungry. Tom and I exchanged a terrified glance. Without a word, we both knew going deeper into the cave was suicide, but going back out into the storm was just as dangerous. We were trapped. We retreated to a small alcove near the entrance, as far from that terrible sound as we could get while still staying out of the rain. Tom tried to lighten the mood, suggesting we tell ghost stories to pass the time, but his laugh was hollow, his eyes constantly darting towards the darkness at the back of the cave. As the hours crawled by, the storm showing no signs of letting up, we heard more sounds echoing from the depths of the cave, scraping noises, like something large dragging itself across stone. Occasionally, we'd hear that growl again, closer each time, sending shivers down my spine. "What do you think it is?" I whispered to Tom, huddled close to him for warmth and comfort. He shook his head, his face pale in the dim light of our flashlights. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's big, and I don't think it's alone." As if in response to his words, we heard another growl, this one from a different direction, then another, and another. The realization hit us like a physical blow. We weren't dealing with one creature, there were several. The night wore on, a nightmare of tense silence broken by those terrible sounds. Every noise made us jump, every shadow seemed to move. We took turns keeping watch, though I'm not sure either of us managed to sleep at all. As the first light of dawn began to filter into the cave entrance, we thought our ordeal might be over. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and fresh, but our relief was short-lived. As we gathered our gear, preparing to make a run for it, we heard something that turned my blood to ice. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the back of the cave. Tom and I froze, our eyes locked on the darkness beyond the reach of our flashlights. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by that now familiar growl. And then we saw them. Eyes, dozens of eyes, glowing in the darkness like burning coals. They were set at various heights, some close to the ground, others far above, belonging to creatures that must have been massive, and they were all fixed on us. What happened next is a blur in my memory. I remember Tom yelling, "Run!" grabbing my hand and pulling me towards the cave entrance. I remember the sound of pursuit behind us, growls and snarls that seemed to shake the very stone around us. We burst out of the cave into the early morning light, not daring to look back. We ran like we'd never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, our lungs burning and our hearts pounding. It wasn't until we reached a clearing, the sun now fully risen, that we finally stopped, collapsing to the ground, gasping for air. Only then did we realize that the sounds of pursuit had stopped. Whatever had been in that cave, it hadn't followed us into the daylight. We made our way back to civilization in a daze, our minds still reeling from what we'd experienced. We reported it to the park rangers, of course, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They promised to investigate, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever was in that cave, I had a feeling it knew how to stay hidden. Tom and I don't talk much about what happened that night. It's too bizarre, too terrifying to put into words. But sometimes, when we're sitting around a campfire with friends and someone starts telling scary stories, we'll catch each other's eye. And I know we're both remembering the cave, the claw marks, those glowing eyes in the darkness. I still hike, still camp. I won't let one terrifying experience ruin my love for the outdoors, but I'm more cautious now, more aware, and if I'm ever caught in a storm again, I think I'd rather take my chances with the lightning than seek shelter in another cave. Because now I know sometimes the real monsters aren't in our imagination or in campfire tales. Sometimes they're lurking just out of sight, waiting in the shadows. And in the deep, dark places of the world, we're not at the top of the food chain anymore. So if you're ever hiking in the mountains and you come across a cave that seems just a little too convenient, remember our story. Remember that there are things out there that we can't explain, creatures that exist in the twilight between myth and reality. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is assume you know all there is to know about the natural world. Because nature, as we learned that night, still has plenty of secrets, and some of them have teeth. Story 22. I've spent my life capturing the beauty of nature through my camera lens. But on that moonlit night in the Cascade Mountains, I photographed something that has haunted me ever since, something that shouldn't exist outside of legend and nightmare. My name's Ryan, and I'm a wildlife photographer. I've trekked through jungles, deserts, and Arctic tundra, always searching for that perfect shot. But it was in my own backyard, so to speak, where I encountered something that shook my understanding of the natural world to its core. It was late September, and I'd ventured deep into the Cascades, hoping to capture some shots of the elusive mountain lion. I'd set up my blind near a known game trail, settled in with my camera gear, and prepared for a long night of waiting. The first few hours were uneventful. I saw a few deer, an owl, even a family of raccoons, but nothing worth writing home about. As midnight approached, I was beginning to think the night would be a bust. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first I thought it might be a bear lumbering through the underbrush, but as it got closer, I realized it was moving on 2 legs, not 4. My heart rate picked up. Could it be? Was I about to get a shot of a mountain lion walking upright? It wasn't unheard of, but it was rare enough that such a photo could make my career. I raised my camera, finger poised over the shutter button. The moonlight was strong that night, filtering through the trees and casting long shadows. Perfect conditions for a night shot. Then it stepped into view, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. The creature stood easily 7 feet tall, its body covered in dark fur. But it was the face that sent a jolt of primal fear through me. It was canine in structure, with a long snout and pointed ears. But there was an intelligence in its eyes that no normal animal should possess. For a moment I forgot to breathe, forgot about my camera. I was frozen, locked in a stare with something that shouldn't exist. Then, operating on instinct honed by years in the field, I started shooting. The rapid-fire click of my camera seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. The creature's head snapped towards me, its eyes reflecting the moonlight like burning coals. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then it let out a howl that shook me to my core. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or coyote. It was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent shivers down my spine. Before I could react, it was gone, melting into the shadows with a speed that defied its size. I sat there, my heart pounding, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the images on my camera's display confirmed what I'd seen. Something impossible. Something that would change everything. With shaking hands, I packed up my gear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I felt eyes on me, watching from the darkness between the trees. It took every ounce of willpower not to break into a run as I made my way back to my campsite. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, knowing that thing was out there? As soon as the sun rose, I hiked back to my car and drove straight home, my mind reeling. Once home, I immediately downloaded the photos onto my computer. Most were blurry, the creature's movement too fast for even my high-speed camera to capture clearly. But a few were crystal clear, and they showed something that defied explanation. The creature was unmistakably canine in appearance, but it stood and moved like a man. Its body was powerfully built, with muscles rippling beneath the fur. But it was the eyes that held me. Even in the photos, there was an intelligence there, a consciousness that went beyond animal instinct. I spent the next few days poring over the images, analyzing every pixel. I compared them to photos of known animals, searched for any sign of digital manipulation. But there was no denying it. What I had captured was real, and it was unlike anything in the scientific record. That's when the internal debate began. Should I release these photos? I knew what it could mean for my career. This was the kind of discovery that makes headlines, that puts a photographer in the history books. But I also knew the scrutiny, the disbelief, the accusations of hoaxing that would inevitably follow. And there was something else, a feeling I couldn't shake, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there were things out there that were meant to stay hidden, that by exposing this creature to the world, I might be unleashing something we weren't prepared to handle. In the end, curiosity won out. I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed answers, needed to understand what I'd seen, so I reached out to a friend in the biology department at the local university, someone I trusted to take me seriously. Dr. Sarah Chen was skeptical at first, as any good scientist would be. But as she looked over the photos, I saw the doubt in her eyes turn to wonder, then to a kind of excited fear. "Ryan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you understand what this could mean? If this is real, it changes everything we thought we knew about mammalian evolution." I nodded, a mix of excitement and dread churning in my stomach. "I know. That's why I came to you. What do we do now?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving the computer screen. "We need to go back. We need more evidence. Photos are a start, but we need hair samples, footprint casts, anything we can analyze in the lab." And so, a week after my encounter, I found myself back in those woods, this time with Sarah and a small team of graduate students. We were armed with cameras, sample collection kits, and an array of scientific equipment I couldn't even name. As we hiked to the spot where I'd seen the creature, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound in the forest set my nerves on edge. We set up camp near the game trail, spreading out our equipment and preparing for a long night of observation. As the sun set and darkness fell over the forest, the atmosphere grew tense. Everyone was on high alert, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Hours passed with no sign of the creature. Some of the grad students were beginning to get restless, casting doubtful glances my way. I could see the question in their eyes. Had I led them out here on a wild goose chase? But Sarah remained focused, her eyes scanning the tree line, her hands steady on her camera. "Be patient," she whispered to me. "If it's out there, it'll show itself when it's ready." As if on cue, a howl split the night air. It was the same bone-chilling sound I'd heard a week ago, a sound that didn't belong to any known animal. The entire camp froze, all eyes turned towards the source of the noise, and then we saw it. At the edge of our camp, just beyond the reach of our lights, stood the creature. It was even larger than I remembered, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. For a moment nobody moved, nobody even breathed. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature was among us. What followed was chaos. Equipment was scattered, tents torn. I heard screams, both human and not. In the confusion, I lost sight of Sarah and the others. All I could focus on was the creature, its eyes locked on mine as it moved through our camp with terrifying purpose. I raised my camera, more out of habit than any real intent to document. As I did, the creature paused. For a heartbeat we stared at each other, and I felt a jolt of recognition. It knew me. It remembered our encounter from a week ago. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the forest. The entire incident had lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. In the aftermath, we regrouped, checking for injuries and assessing the damage. Miraculously, no one was seriously hurt, though our equipment hadn't fared as well. But we had evidence, fur samples caught on torn tents, clear footprints in the soft earth, and most importantly, more photos and videos. As we hurriedly packed up what remained of our camp, eager to get back to the safety of civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a line. We'd gone looking for proof of something extraordinary, and we'd found it. But at what cost? In the weeks that followed, as Sarah and her team analyzed the evidence we'd gathered, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Every time I ventured into the woods, I felt eyes on me. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear a howl in the distance that made my blood run cold. We're preparing to publish our findings, to reveal to the world the existence of something that defies explanation. But a part of me wonders if we're making a mistake. If there are some mysteries that are meant to remain unsolved, some creatures that should stay hidden in the shadows of our world. Because now I know, the line between legend and reality is thinner than we think, and sometimes when we go looking for the unknown, it looks back, and it follows us home. Story 23. I've spent my career studying the natural world, but nothing in my years of research could have prepared me for what I encountered in those remote forests. Some discoveries I've learned come at a terrible price. My name is Karen, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large predators. When reports of strange animal activity started coming out of the Olympic National Forest in Washington, I jumped at the chance to investigate. Little did I know that this research trip would challenge everything I thought I knew about nature and myself. It was early October when I arrived in the small town of Forks, Washington. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the forest was a riot of reds and golds. I'd come prepared for an extended stay, my truck loaded with camping gear, research equipment, and enough supplies to last several weeks. The local ranger station was my first stop. The rangers there were friendly but guarded, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes as they briefed me on the recent incidents. Livestock killed in unusual ways, hikers reporting eerie sounds and a feeling of being watched, strange tracks that didn't match any known animal. "Just be careful out there, Dr. Thompson," the head ranger, a grizzled man named Jim, told me as I was leaving. "These woods, they've got secrets. Some of them might be best left alone." I brushed off his warning at the time, attributing it to local superstition. Now, I wish I'd listened more closely. My first few days in the forest were uneventful. I set up trail cameras, collected scat samples, and recorded animal calls. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual signs of bears, cougars, and smaller forest dwellers. It was on the fourth night that things started to get strange. I was camped in a small clearing, my tent set up near the base of a massive old-growth cedar. The fire had burned down to embers, and I was about to turn in when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was a howl, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost subsonic, then rose to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote. It was something other. I scrambled for my audio recorder, managing to catch the tail end of the sound. As it faded away, an unnatural silence fell over the forest. No insects chirping, no nightbirds calling. It was as if every living thing was holding its breath. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake in my tent, straining my ears for any sound, my hand never far from the bear spray at my side. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, but eager to see if my trail cameras had captured anything. What I found sent a chill down my spine. Most of the cameras showed nothing unusual, but one had captured an image that defied explanation. It was blurry, taken at the edge of the camera's range, but I could make out a figure. It was tall, far taller than a man, with a body that seemed to be covered in thick fur. But it was standing upright, its posture unmistakably bipedal. I spent the morning analyzing the photo, trying to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, but the proportions were all wrong, the stance too natural for an animal not adapted for bipedal movement. That's when I found the tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear impressions of toes and what looked like claws. They were fresh, the edges still crisp in the soft forest soil. My scientific mind warred with the primal fear growing in my gut. This was the discovery of a lifetime, potential proof of a species unknown to science, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and get out of these woods. In the end, curiosity won out. I had to know more. I had to understand what I was dealing with. Over the next few days, I focused my research on the area where I'd found the tracks and captured the photo. I set up more cameras, collected hair samples caught on tree bark, and made casts of the footprints I found. Each night I heard that strange howl again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. And each morning I'd find new signs of the creature's passage, more tracks, trees with bark stripped away by powerful claws, half-eaten carcasses of deer that had been killed with a strength no known predator possessed. A week into my investigation, I hit the jackpot. One of my trail cameras captured a clear video of the creature. It was only a few seconds long, but it was enough to turn my world upside down. The being in the video was like nothing I'd ever seen. It stood easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and canine features, with a protruding snout full of sharp teeth and eyes that glowed in the camera's infrared light. But it was the way it moved that truly terrified me. There was a fluidity, a purposefulness to its gait that spoke of intelligence far beyond that of a normal animal. I must have watched that video 100 times, my mind struggling to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew about the natural world. This wasn't just an undiscovered species. This was something that shouldn't exist, something that blurred the line between man and beast. That night, as I sat by my campfire reviewing my notes, I heard the howl again, but this time it was answered by another, then another. The realization hit me like a physical blow. There wasn't just one of these creatures. There was a whole pack. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night huddled in my tent, my heart racing at every sound from the forest around me. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made a decision. I had to get out of there, had to bring my findings to my colleagues. This was too big, too dangerous for me to handle alone. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, the feeling of being watched prickling at the back of my neck. Just as I was loading the last of my gear into my truck, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, and there it was. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the creature I'd seen in the video. In person, it was even more terrifying. It stood upright, its massive form silhouetted against the morning mist. Those eyes, glowing with an unnatural intelligence, were fixed on me. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other. I was frozen, caught between fear and a scientist's instinct to observe. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature raised a clawed hand and pointed at me. The message was clear. It knew who I was. It knew what I'd been doing, and it was letting me go. This time. I didn't need a second warning. I jumped into my truck and peeled out of there, gravel spraying from my tires. In my rearview mirror, I saw the creature step out onto the road, watching me go. It made no attempt to chase me, but somehow that was even more terrifying. The drive back to civilization was a blur. My mind was racing, trying to process everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned. I knew I had evidence that could rock the scientific community to its core, but I also knew the danger that came with that knowledge. As I pulled into the ranger station to report my findings, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. There, at the edge of the forest, I saw a flash of fur, a glint of eyes watching me, a clear warning. I've spent the weeks since then analyzing my data, reviewing my samples and footage. I've written and rewritten my report more times than I can count, but I haven't published anything. Not yet. Because now I understand what that old ranger was trying to tell me. Some secrets are kept for a reason. Some discoveries come at too high a price. I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, my heart pounding, sure that I can hear that unearthly howl echoing through my dreams. And I wonder, did I really escape those woods? Or did something follow me out? Something that's watching, waiting, making sure I keep it secret? So if you're ever hiking in the deep forests of the Olympic Peninsula and you feel eyes on you or hear a howl that doesn't sound quite right, remember my story. Remember that there are things out there that defy explanation, creatures that exist in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. And sometimes it's better to walk away, to leave the mystery unsolved, because once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back, and the watchers in the woods, they don't forget, and they don't forgive.